Hello, everybody. I think. um, right. I think we are all online. I hope, at least. Yes, people are seeing me. Well, this is good. Hopefully they're hearing me as well. That'd be rather embarrassing if they aren't. Cool. Right. Okay, so we're good. So, as hopefully most of you will be aware, this is the live segment of the Patreon Drydock. So the first segment will be going through the Patreon alternate history questions and a few other latecomer questions. And then I'll be taking questions from the chat, etc. So, I mean, you can write questions in the chat if you like, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it because, well, it'll be a while before I start looking at all those questions. So, let's begin with the Patreon questions. There we go. Right. Okay, if people are finding me a little bit quiet, if I do that, that should be a little bit louder. I'll just move the microphone a bit closer. Right, so Andrew Dederer leads off today's questions with, for all the grief the Royal Navy deservedly gets for its stop-starts approach to centralised fire control, why is the High Seas Fleet let off the hook? The High Seas Fleet fought Jutland without a single ship with centralised firing. This seems rather strange, as instrumentation was one thing Germany was ahead of Britain in. Did they just find it easier to get a good estimate with a rangefinder, ladder to a straddle and fire at will? Did this notably hurt their fire in any of the major actions? It's not strictly true to say the Germans didn't have any centralised firing. What it is true to say is that they didn't have as advanced centralised firing as the British did. At least when you're looking at the latest British ships and the latest British rangefinding and fire control technology deployed to the battle. For example, the German system that they had would do training, but it didn't do elevation. The British system did both. As far as why this was the case, there were one or two German ships that had a little bit more advanced systems, but they were relatively few and far between. I'm just trying to find... yes, here it is. The German system that, say, for example, Der Flinger had the one, and of course it's German, so of course it's going to be long and complicated, and I apologise to any German speakers because I'm probably going to mangle this, but the full system was called the Entfernungsunterschiedspeilschreiber. Yeah, and that was aboard Der Flinger, and that was pretty much equivalent to the centralised fire control systems on various Royal Navy ships, but the centralised fire control systems on various Royal Navy vessels were quite different in their capabilities if you went from ship to ship. So the 12-inch gunned ships, mostly, with the exception of Hercules, had Dreher table Mark 1s. Most of the 13.5-inch ships either had Mark 3 tables or Mark 1 tables with a turret control table separately. Queen Mary, of course, was kind of doing her own thing with an Argo clock, although she also had a Mark II table. And then some of the latest ships, so the 15-inch gunships, basically, plus Tiger, they had Dreher table Mark IVs. And that showed up quite significantly because the difference between a Dreher Mark I and a Dreher Mark IV is like night and day. It's also to do with how well you actually use it. Tiger, of course, not having the world's best gunnery day at Jutland, despite having one of the most advanced fire control systems on either side. Conversely, the Queen Elizabeths had actually pretty much the best gunnery day of anybody on any side during the battle. So it just goes to show you can have all the technology you can get, but unless your crew is very good at using it, then it's not really going to make much difference. But when they do use it, and they do use it properly, it gets very, very scary very, very quickly. As the German battle cruisers would find out when 5th Battle Squadron showed up. The German system basically, for range finding, incidentally relied on large numbers of stereoscopic rangefinders and then taking an average between all of them, which combined with their ladder system actually let them get on target pretty quickly, despite the limitations of their fire control directors. Although, being stereoscopic rangefinders, as I covered in the video on fire control plotting, they did tend to tire their crews out pretty quickly. So, the next question comes from Ash. He says, while exploring the legalities of interned ships, I came across a story, later novel, later fictionalized movie, of Operation Creek, German merchant ships transmitting intelligence to U-boats whilst interned in neutral Portuguese Goa. I also remember that in Das Boot, another interned civilian ship acted as a mothership for U-boats in the Mediterranean. Were there more actual cases of subversion ships interned but still aiding the war effort illegally? And did the Allies operate any? Not really that many, if any, to be perfectly honest, because the circumstances for the Ehrenfelds in Operation, which was then subject to Operation Creek, were somewhat unique in that Goa was a very, very, very small enclave in the middle of British India, which allowed them a front row seat for all the British and other Allied merchant ships leaving and entering what was then called Bombay. But because it was neutral, the crews could stay interned and stay on the ships. Pretty much anywhere else, you were going to find that a German ship that was in a port, if it was interned, would either have the crew taken off, or the port would be a hostile one and they'd just be removed, period, immediately. So, for example, in the US, there were a number of German ships when the US was neutral. But because the US was completely neutral, they could come and go as they pleased. There wasn't much reason to hang around and report, because it would be very suspicious if they just hung around and kept. And then mysteriously, ships started sinking just off, say, New York Harbor. And that's pretty much the same everywhere else. There aren't many places where a ship could be interned and the crew could be left aboard without somebody noticing that something was up and being able to do something about it. There were a number of instances of ostensibly neutral ships having rather hidden stings in their tails. There was, for example, a Portuguese cod fishing boat, of all things, which had a couple of German agents aboard and nearly gave away Operation Torch. They got arrested on the high seas because the Allies kind of had figured out the game and were basically of the opinion that they'd rather just take whatever minor flack they might get from the Portuguese government for seizing one of their vessels at sea rather than give away, an entire amphibious landing. And of course there's the ever wonderful wrecked merchant ship just opposite Gibraltar on the Spanish side of the harbour, which the Italians based a bunch of their underwater manned torpedoes out of for pretty much the entire duration of Italy's involvement in World War II, which no one ever noticed, which was quite funny. Then we have Tom Harper 1997 asking, can you give an overview of the Battle of the Komandorsky Islands? Yeah, it's on the list of things to do. I've actually been working out the list of things to do for next year, and most Wednesday videos are actually, apart from the ones that Patrons vote for, pretty much locked in down to maybe October, and that's just based on scripts I'm working on at the moment. That's not even based on the rest of the list of things to work on once I finish these scripts. Andre Gardner asks, if you do not already have one assembled and one were generously provided to you, would you do a live stream or time-lapse video of you assembling a Kobe Blocks HMS Warspite. I don't see why not, if people would want to see that. I mean, I do have, I think, the Kobe Block, I think it's Kobe Blocks Bliskovica. That's quite fun. I keep looking at Warspite when I see it and thinking, should I get it? But yeah, if people want to see me build it, I might as well. Give a running commentary of Warspite's history as we put it together. Michael Thomas, what do you think would have happened if Bismarck and Prince Eugen had reversed course after the Battle of the Denmark Strait and tried to retreat home the way they came? What reserve forces would have come to their aid, and what kind of major naval battle could have occurred en route back to port? If they'd reversed course, then Suffolk, Norfolk and Prince of Wales would have seen them coming, probably had to fall back before them, and then at that point, near enough certainly, King George V and Victorious, plus every cruiser and destroyer in the home fleet that they can scrape up, is going to come herring north to back up Prince of Wales, Norfolk and Suffolk, and you're going to get a fairly major fight of it, well beyond the range of Luftwaffe air cover. That would be my main expectation for that scenario. Roland Anthony Rupp the Fourth asks, another alternate history, this is late 1861s in New Orleans, or New Orleans. Thanks to better cooperation between Army and Navy commands in the area, the historical manpower shortages suffered by the yards at Jefferson City are significantly reduced. This allows for CSS Louisiana to be finished in early March instead of late April. How would her presence affect the subsequent battles of Fort Jackson and Fort Phillip? Given her numerous problems, the poor condition of other friendly forces in the area and the numbers facing her, is there any way she could prevent the capture of New Orleans? Not prevent, slow down, certainly. I mean, the Louisiana in many ways resembles CSS Virginia, so she's a decent-ish ironclad for a scratch build, but at that point you've got it's pretty much the case all across the American Civil War. The Confederacy could build some pretty dangerous ironclads in place, but the Union just has the sheer numbers and economic advantage. So if she'd been finished earlier, she would have slowed down the assault until the Union could bring up their own ironclads to fight her. But at the same time, they would have brought up their own ironclads to fight her sooner or later. So it would have ended up just delaying matters a little bit, and that's pretty much it. Hello, Dr. Clark. I actually spotted you in the chat this time. Moongara asks, based on a question from the last Patreon livestream, in the 1894 Russian-French navies versus Royal Navy scenario, what would be the strangest ships there other than the French pre-dreads and Russian circular warships? That's almost, to be honest, it would be an easy question to answer which wouldn't be strange ships to be there. This is one of the issues, because I did find someone very kindly who has stepped forward, and I've begun the process of commissioning an actual artwork of the engagement. The problem we've run into is that even though 1894 is worryingly close to things like the Spanish-American War and the Russo-Japanese War, where we think of things in terms of pre-dreadnoughts and protected cruisers and that kind of reasonably well-established fleet, in 1894, pretty much every ironclad that the Royal Navy had ever built and hadn't sunk at that point, like Captain, was still in service. I mean, HMS Warrior, the very first ironclad that the Royal Navy built, was still technically in service as an armoured cruiser. I think it was listed as a second-class armoured cruiser. And whilst the French had scrapped a few of their early ironclads, like the Gloire and its sister ships, and the Russians were kind of in a similar boat, the vast majority of French iron and Russian ironclad output was still afloat. So you can literally look at, I don't know, look at a list of ironclads built by those three major navies, and outside of maybe the first half dozen to a dozen on the French and Russian sides, literally everything else could potentially have been there, including some of the really weird and wacky ones. So, yeah, 1894 is a weird one because at that point, the Victoria class are pretty much the most advanced Royal Navy ships that are going to be present and actively commissioned. So it would have been a glorious mess. Cypher asks, what are some of your favourite naval aircraft and why? Since this is totally opinion based, we could go with from any time period or any time period. Well, if we're going to do any time period, then... Where's my drink gone? There it is. Any time period, that allows me to go into jets as well. So, if I was going to say take a top 5 naval aircraft, and for that I'm going to disqualify converted aircraft that were taken from land use, like the Seafire and such like. So in no particular order, favourite naval aircraft would probably have to include the Buccaneer S2, just because it is such a fantastically advanced aircraft with so many different concepts for its time. The F-14 Tomcat, because... yeah, Tomcat. Everyone loves a Tomcat. It's... yeah, there's something about just like, yeah, we have two very big engines and we're going very fast in any given direction that we choose. Plus, of course, the Phoenix missiles, which are quite amusing, especially when you read the accounts of what some of the Iranian pilots managed to get up to with their F-14 and Phoenix combos in the Iran-Iraq war. Critical tip. Don't fly your aircraft in World War II V formations when someone's around trucking with a missile almost as large as a small aircraft itself. Joel Thompson, is the Hercules a naval aircraft? Well, they landed one on a carrier, but again, mostly land-based. I know someone's going to insist I say the Blackburn, but that's more of a meme craft than anything else. The Sea Hornet, because it represents just gotta go fast, and the Bearcat as well. The Sea Hornet and the Bearcat are wonderful examples of the immediate post-war naval aircraft development of piston-engined aircraft. The Sea Hornet's kind of like, we take everything that makes the Mosquito a good aircraft and we turn it up to 11 so it goes insanely quick. And the Bearcat is someone looking at the Hellcat and looking at the Wildcat and going, well, what if we took that power plant and we put it in this much smaller fuselage? So effectively, and then someone turns around and says, well, effectively what you're asking for is an engine to which we have affixed a very unfortunate pilot and some wings. And yeah, the Drydock said, yes, this is the case. Dear. And then if I was going to pick a last naval aircraft, see, there are so many good naval aircraft. I'd be tempted to pick a flying boat, but then again, a lot of those were kind of pressed into service rather than purpose designed. I do have a bit of a weakness for a lot of the late 1940s last generation piston and turboprop driven aircraft. So it's difficult to break out of one of those. Although I think I temporarily have a little bit of a weakness for some of the interwar US carrier fighters, mainly because I've just watched a bunch of footage from the US National Archives, which includes a gloriously tubby little aircraft bouncing its way merrily down the flight deck of, I think it's Lexington, looking for all the world like a giant kid's toy. before, for some inexplicable reason, suddenly deciding it was just going to roll over on its side like a dog that wants its belly scratched, and I'm not entirely sure what prompted that, considering it looked like it was going all of about 4 miles an hour at the time. It just looks so hilarious to see. Yeah, lots of people listing brilliant aircraft: Swordfish, Sea Fury, Sky Raider, Wyvern, etc. Yeah, of course, the F8 Crusader. The F8 Crusader is really nice as well. But you can list off good naval aircraft for a very, very long time. I mean, even the F4 Phantom, the F4 Phantom, about as aerodynamic in any given direction, but still a very long-serving aircraft, and again, one I have something of a weakness for because it was one of my earliest Airfix kits, painted horrifically in gloss black enamel, but yeah, that's a thing. That's Cypher's question. So Leops 1984 asks, the Western Allies benefited considerably from the technological exchange during World War II. What technology, weapon, etc. would each Axis navy have most benefited from getting from each of the other two Axis navies, assuming that whatever is exchanged could be produced at least as easily as any similar piece of domestic equipment by the acquiring navy? The Japanese could have benefited from German radar, because then they'd actually have some, at least before right up at the end of the war. And from the Italian side, the Italian 37mm anti-aircraft gun, because they would have had something that they could use to get rid of the 25mm. So that would be, yeah, I think that for the Japanese that would be good, because then they get a decent, they get a medium AA gun that just happens to be half decent, plus actually radar, so they can see things that aren't bright summer's days. Then you've got, from the Italian side of things, for the Italians and the Germans, I think in both cases getting the Japanese Type 93 and Type 95 oxygen fuel torpedoes would do them a world of good. What would the Italians want from the Germans? Probably radar again. And what would the Germans want from the Italians? Technology-wise, to be perfectly honest, again, probably the Italian 37mm AA gun, because although they had a decent 37mm AA gun, it was right up toward the end of the war, rather than at the beginning. The Italian 37 was pretty good from the start. Theodore Camus poses an alternate history scenario in which the 2nd Pacific Squadron is hauled into Scapa after attacking the British trawlers, and for some reason unforeseen to man, Beatty is placed in charge of the 2nd Pacific Squadron instead of Rozhesvensky, which allows them to go via the Suez Canal, fuel up in British ports in Singapore, etc., etc. What could Beatty have done at better than Rozhesvensky at Tsushima? At that point in time, Beatty isn't an admiral, not by a long shot. If my memory serves, he's either aboard the rather aptly named HMS Arrogant, or possibly he's just moved off to his next command in 1904. But that would be where Beatty is. So he'd only be a captain. So the odds of getting anyone to listen to him, even assuming that for some reason anyone paid any attention to him, would be fairly slim. But assuming for the sake of the scenario, to be perfectly honest, Rozhesvensky did pretty much as good as he could, given the circumstances. The biggest advantages that a theoretical Beatty in command would have at Tsushima would be the fact that being able to fuel up in British ports and transiting via the Suez Canal, his ships are going to be less worn, less fouled, less covered in coal dust, so they're going to be slightly less flammable, in better shape, and probably with the crew's morale slightly better, which, all things considered, will stand them in better stead for actually hitting the Japanese at Tsushima. There's not an awful lot they can do about the substandard performance of the Russian shells, but it might allow them to put a lot more hurt on Togo. If there's a very outside chance that they might be able to really punish Togo for his turnabout point in the face of enemy fire, but that would depend on the shells actually functioning properly. Yeah, Archangel Glenn, I don't think the Littorios count as a single piece of technology. Otherwise, yeah, they probably would want them. Earl Collins asks, long ago I read a novel about the US building a class of battleship designed to survive nuclear strikes. To this end, its centre screws were retractable as well as one of its rudders, if I remember correctly. Considering how Bismarck and Prince of Wales were lost, has there been any attempt to protect the screws and rudders besides having multiples of both? In theory, some of the US ships have a kind of protection for their inner propellers. When you look at when you look at some of the Drydock pictures of the North Carolina, South Dakota, and Iowa classes, you notice the skegs for the outer propellers almost form a tunnel. So that would provide a certain amount of protection for the inner propellers, but that's more to do with hydrodynamics. I don't think that's a specific attempt to actually protect the propellers. The main problem with trying to guard the screws or rudders is that they need as much free flow of water over them as possible to do their jobs. The more and more you protect them, the more and more you restrict the flow of water, and therefore you actually go slower and can't maneuver anywhere near as well. So, yeah, you're not really going to get much benefit out of protecting them, because you're going to end up going so slow and being so clumsy that anything that you're protecting your propulsion and guidance systems from is just going to smash into your hull and probably sink you anyway. Sreko asks, the year is 1870 and you're a ship designer in the service of the most glorious British Empire. The Queen has set a task: make a ship that will travel in a straight line from Pakistan. Well, technically that's just another part of India at this point in time, but anyway, between Madagascar and Africa, between Antarctica and Tierra del Fuego, straight over the Pacific, close to Point Nemo, and all the way to Kamchatka without a single stop. All the way for the glory of the Empire. Can you do it? Oh, can I? In 1870? In theory, yes. I don't think anyone's going to like the solution, though. I mean, this whole problem of how far can you go on a ship that doesn't need refueling was pretty much what led to the Great Eastern a few decades earlier. It basically exploiting the square cube law, that the volume increases, so eventually if you make a ship big enough, you can just fit enough fuel on regardless of the efficiency of the engines. Now, if you used a Great Eastern style scheme of multiple propulsion systems, i.e. able to fully move with sails and with engines, although you probably won't want the paddle wheels, just screws and sails, then considering the advances in boiler efficiency and engine technology in the period between the building of the Great Eastern and 1870, if you did build some kind of monstrous 40,000 ton ship, I still don't think you could make it go all the way, even one way, just on the fuel. But you could certainly build a ship that could go a good chunk of the way and maintain its way using engines, even if for significant periods it was cruising on under sails. But yeah, so you could do it, but it would result in a project that would make even the Great Eastern look small, which is not really any mean feat, to be perfectly honest. Free D Wood asks, in the year 2220,
Naming of a new class of ship for the Earth's spaceship navy. You need 20 important admirals from history that would deserve a ship named after them. Since these ships are supposed to represent all of Earth, these admirals or naval officers should come from a wide range of nations and time periods. Okay, that shouldn't be too difficult then. Let's see. Yi Sin Shin, Drake, Sims, Nimitz, Cunningham, Shear, Hipper. Let's try to think of some non-British and American admirals that we can add. I'm definitely not going to name one after Villeneuve. That's just asking for trouble. Oh, let's call one Rozhesvensky anyway, because that's fun. We're up to 9. I mean, technically, you could call one. What was that? Technically, you could call one Hannibal. Something just fell over in the room, and I'm the only one in here, so that's slightly worrying. Oh yeah, Cook, Nelson. Who else should we take? Mitchell. I feel Admiral Mitchell is a little bit overlooked. Oh yes, of course. How could I forget Admiral Tegethoff? You must take Admiral Tegethoff. Tromp, De Ruyter. So we're up to 16. The last 4. A lot of people going for Captain Grau, Makarov. Makarov's a little bit unlucky. I think Grau, Togo. Yes, I would agree with that. I'm sure there must be a couple of Swedish admirals as well. Do you have a Frenchman? Now, the problem is the French don't have very many notable admirals from the Napoleon. I know there are a few. They had a few very good admirals in the immediate run-up to the Napoleonic War in the pre-revolutionary period. I can't think for the life of me what the names of some of them were, though, unfortunately. Yes, Spanish admirals. For the is it Blas de Liesas or something like that? He held one of the ports against the British in quite a significant style. Anyway, that's 20 or so. Yeah, the main thing is coming up with ones that are all across time and history. I suppose you could probably go with Zheng He as well. That would be quite a good one. Name the biggest one after Zheng He. That'd be quite amusing. Call that treasure ship. Stefan M. Germany doesn't invade Belgium in 1914. Britain stays neutral, but denies Germany the use of the Channel and Straits of Gibraltar. The Austro-Hungarian Navy puts together a task force to raid French troop convoys in the Mediterranean, taking 3 Tegethoffs, 3 Roszetskis, 3 Erzerhogs, and Goeben for some reason. Okay. The French sortie to intercept them, due to the speed of their older pre-dreadnoughts, only taking 4 Corbeils and 6 Dantons. So both sides have 10 capital ships. The French have a much larger broadside, 64 12-inch guns versus 48 12-inch and 10 11-inch. But the French have the 36 to 24 advantage in 9.4-inch guns, but the Austrian 12-inch guns have a higher range. Who has a greater chance of winning? Ooh. Corbeils versus Tegethoffs. Now, there's a battle in the lower tiers of dreadnoughts. I'd be barring Goeben doing something particularly weird, I'd be fractionally tempted to give it to the French because of the Dantons. The Roszetskis and the Erzerhogs are very definitely pre-dreadnoughts. The Dantons, whilst they aren't quite semi-dreadnoughts, they're part of the way there, and they are designed for a kind of a very close-range melee fight.
So I think with the Corbe, if the Corbeys and the Tegethoffs are kind of facing off with each other, the Dantons probably have the upper hand in the pre-dreadnought engagement, and they're just about big enough and mean enough that survivors would be able to assist any surviving Corbeys against any surviving Tegethoffs. So I'd probably give it to the French just about at that point. But it could go either way. To be honest, a lot of it I think is going to depend on whether the Tegethoffs are still having some of the ventilation issues that they were known for. Because if they are, then that is a very definite swing in favour of the French. Whereas if a lot of the issues that they initially had at things like the bombardment of Ancona have been resolved, it makes it a much more even fight. Lost Muffin Man, yeah, Yi Sin Shin was my first one, on my first choice. Bill Cunningham says, you've been given a magic bullet. Fire it, and it will kill whatever person in naval history at whatever time you decide they should die. Whom would you choose to kill, and why? That's a difficult one. I know that someone actually responded to this on Patreon as a comment and just said Beatty, but much as I am loath to say anything positive about Beatty because of his performance at Dogger Bank and Jutland, he was still a very good political admiral and definitely helped the Royal Navy quite considerably in the 1920s when they needed an admiral who was basically a politician. So getting rid of him would be counterproductive. Any person in naval history, if I could just knock them off. I mean, I'm kind of torn a little bit. Yeah, I'm kind of torn a little bit between taking out Jean Soule just before Moselle Kabir purely on the grounds that I think, given the way that every single other standoff with French ships went around the time of Operation Catapult, Jean Soule's went by far the worst, and as you probably know from the Moselle Kabir video, I do kind of put a lot of the blame on him. Then again, he literally was only following orders, albeit very badly. Actually, you know what? I'd take out Darlan. I'd actually take out Darlan. Because Jean Soule was put in the situation that he was in, i.e. with the British not trusting a single thing the French were saying, because Darlan seemed to change positions about as often as he changed shirts in the run-up to Operation Catapult. So basically, yeah, if I could take out Darlan immediately after he'd given everyone assurances that the French fleet would fight on, especially if I could make it look like a German had done it, that would probably be the ultimate way of changing history, because then the rest of the French Navy will be very motivated to fulfill his kind of, if you like, final orders, which would then mean the Free French Navy would pretty much consist of most of the Marine Nationale. So, yeah. I am picking up the Super Chat questions as well, but as I said, I've got to get through these Patreon ones first. But I will answer them and I will answer also questions from the chat, obviously. Graham R asks a very contentious question. Your personal opinions on World of Warships and War Thunder. Which one is better and why? Realism-wise, War Thunder has something of an advantage. Range of ships-wise and player base-wise, to be perfectly honest, when it comes to naval fights, World of Warships has the advantage. I mean, the thing is, I haven't played War Thunder Naval Combat in a long time because I got so annoyed with it in the first few months, and also the player base dropped away. So I guess the fact that I still play World of Warships and I don't really play War Thunder Naval Forces probably gives you a very short summation of my opinion on that particular question. But, I mean, there are improvements I'd like to see in both games. That I think the thing that disappointed me the most about War Thunder Naval Forces is that it was much more realistic in a lot of ways, but in other ways, because I think they kind of missed a few of the things that you need if you are actually going to make things realistic, like fire control computer systems telling you where where at least where it thinks you should be aiming, and that's not a particularly hard thing to work out. I mean, even at Atlantic Fleet, which is a much less complicated game than War Thunder when it comes to naval simulations, that is able to pull off the whole, your fire control computer suggests you should shoot here. Maybe I'll drop back into War Thunder Naval at some point. Ort Kaiser asks, Christmas 1910, the Austro-Hungarian Navy gets £6 million through divine intervention and can spend it abroad in the next 12 months. What would you recommend buying? Using your future knowledge, the fact that this acquisition would not affect upcoming historical acquisitions, and you want to affect the Austro-Hungarian Navy in a positive way. Ooh, that's an interesting one. £6 million. I mean, that'll buy almost 4 dreadnoughts. Although by 1910, with the increasing price and size of ships, maybe 3. So maybe you could either order probably 3 dreadnoughts or 2 battle cruisers. To be perfectly honest, I'd probably order a couple of battle cruisers. Yeah, I'd probably order a couple of up-armoured Lion types. Sacrifice a couple of knots off of a Lion-style battle cruiser's top speed, given that the British yards, if you start in 1910, will probably just about get things delivered in time before the war. I would, so some slightly more heavily armoured, slightly slower Lion class, because to be perfectly honest, there's nothing really that Lion with an 11-inch belt is going to be facing off against that it's going to be too worried about in the Austro-Hungarian theatre of operations, and being able to move at about 25 knots would help an awful lot more than buying a dreadnought that is a bit slower, or 4 knots slower, but carries an extra pair of guns. So yeah, couple of those. Admiralty of Floof, what's your favourite alternate history what if you haven't mentioned it yet? Alternate histories, I kind of like reading them for the ideas, but in terms of mainstream, I've read some very niche ones which are quite nice, and those of you who have been chatting on Discord over the years will probably know which ones I'm referring to. But in terms of mainstream published alternate history works, I think probably the one I've had the most inclination to reread has probably been The Two Georges by Harry Turtledove. Okay, now things are falling over slightly closer to me. This is very bizarre. I do hope one of the gerbils hasn't escaped. If you suddenly see me dive off of screen, you'll know it's I'm on gerbil catching duty, assuming the poor little thing doesn't chew through a power cable or something first. Anyway. Admiralty of Floof also asks, there seems to be some reluctance to accept that some ships are very capable in some roles and not to others, but will consistently put in that role. Why do people not seem to be able to accept this fact and just use the ships at what they excel at? Partly just sheer need. You can design a ship for a specific role, but if it turns out that it fulfills that role and then therefore has no job, you have to use it for something else, otherwise it's a pointless waste of time and money, which to a certain extent is what happened to the battle cruisers. They were designed to exterminate enemy commerce raiders, and they did a pretty good job of exterminating all the major enemy commerce raider threats. And then what? So yeah, that kind of is a bit of a problem for certain ships with specific niches. But I think there's also just a little bit of, well, this ship has proven very effective at doing this job, therefore it must be an effective ship, therefore we need this other job done, which seems to be somewhat related, and therefore we shall press this ship into that duty. And sometimes it works, sometimes it really doesn't. RJ Blaine asks, from my husband, everything I can find easily online seems to suggest caliber equals gun barrel diameter. In your talks it seems different. What am I missing? I also answered this question, I think, in the Patreon Drydock recorded one, and it's basically that in naval guns, amongst other types of weaponry, gun caliber serves two functions. One is to, yes, tell you the diameter of the gun barrel. The other is also to tell you the length of the barrel relative to the caliber. So a 16-inch 50 caliber weapon is 16 inches at the muzzle, and it's 50 times 16 inches long. So yeah, that's what I mean. It's like, so when I say a 5-inch 38 caliber, it's 5-inch barrel width and 38 times 5 inches long. John Rees asks, if a nation during World War II was not able to produce or import ball bearings, what would that have any effect on ship design? Yes, a lot. There's an awful lot of things that use ball bearings on ships, but the single biggest one is probably going to be the thrust blocks, which are the parts of the ship that make sure that the thrust on the propeller shafts, because bear in mind every action has an equal and opposite reaction, so if the ship's going one way, the propeller shafts are going to go the other. The thrust blocks are what mean that opposing force is transmitted into the ship's hull and not just ramming the propeller shafts right back into the turbines. And they use ball bearings as part of the bearings mounts so that the propellers can still spin. If you no longer have ball bearings, you're going to end up with some very, very inefficient thrust blocks, or if they just if like bearings of any description stop working, your ships are going to have to slow down massively, or else they're going to, you're going to have things like the grease catching fire, which is not a good thing. Well, it might be a good thing for your enemy, but there you go. Jonathan Welch, could you go over USS Hornet's flight to nowhere from the Battle of Midway? And yes, I did answer your previous question, Jonathan, about Admiral Scott instead of Callahan. I'll have to look back through the question list at some point to see which video it's in, but I did answer that one. So as far as USS Hornet's flight to nowhere from the Battle of Midway, I am going to cover that in a reasonable amount of detail, actually, in a video that's coming up this year. So yeah, look out for that, basically. He also asks, in the universe derived by Terry Pratchett, the disc world exists as a flat plane of discs supported by 4 elephants, all riding the great world turtle Atween. Yes, of course it is. How, in such a world, do you think maritime navigation would be conducted, and how would it differ from our oblate spheroid world? Good question. Because at that point, in the disc world, the sun goes around the disc world, so using that as a fixed point of reference is pretty useless. Although you could still take sightings at something like, say, midday, because if the sun follows a known path across the sky of the disc world, you could probably then look at it and see pretty much how you calculate your position with a sextant at sea in our world. You could work out, okay, well, if at midday the sun is at this kind of angle, or in this direction wouldn't make so much difference, but if it's at this kind of angle, you could work out then where you were on a circle, I guess, on the disc world. As for working out which direction on that circle you were, you'd probably have to watch where the sun rose, knowing that it rises in the east, and then trying to figure that out from that would kind of probably give you a line to where you could try and intersect the circle. But to be perfectly honest, my ideas on navigational capabilities on a perfectly flat disc plane on the back of a giant turtle is not exactly very advanced. Yes, and Mechanized points out, yeah, a combination of magic and narrative plot as well will probably take you the right direction. Either that or just follow the old school method of hug the coastline and stay away from the edge of the world. Dominic von Bismarck. In the early 1930s, the US and Japan form a Pacific alliance. As anti-British sentiment rises, France accelerates the building of ships in response to German and Italian naval exercises, where many shell quality issues are hammered out. The English-led allies, including France, become alarmed as the USSR builds hordes of cruisers, and in 1940 a four-way war breaks out. The Pacific Alliance, the Allies, Germany and Italy, and finally the USSR, declaring they're going to give the world communism. In this alternative world, what would the naval landscape look like, and what kind of battles would be fought? Finally, who do you believe would wrest control of the seas? Depends who fights who. And how they go about their tactics. In theory, the combined naval strength of England and or the UK and France should be able to kick the Germans and Italians 6 ways from Sunday, assuming that they've ramped up their ship production. And similarly, they should be able to deal with any Black Sea and Baltic Sea Soviet forces, because to be perfectly honest, Soviet pre-war cruisers, they can build a lot of them, but they're not going to service all that much in the way of actually, doing their jobs. You're talking about Kirovs and, if at best, Chapayevs. Just no. It's gonna come down to the English-French alliance versus, or the British-French alliance versus the Japanese-American alliance. In that case, I mean, you've got America with its massive industrial capability, but I think at that point it's going to depend on who's been fighting what kind of war. If the American-Japanese alliance has decided it's going to mop up the entirety of the Pacific, probably Australia as well, and then start making inroads into the Atlantic, whilst the Anglo-French alliance is trying to deal with the other two, then they'll win the whole thing pretty easily. If they kind of go, well, we have our glorious gigantic Pacific Lake and we don't really care about anything that happens outside of it, then it's probably going to depend largely on how the other wars go, i.e. does the Anglo-French alliance manage to take over other, like maybe Germany and Italy, and add their industrial potential to their own, in which case it probably kind of evens out? Or is it just a case of, well, we've knocked them into submission, but they're still there as their own independent countries, in which case the American-Japanese alliance has an industrial advantage, mainly on the basis of America, to be perfectly honest. Darren Liu asks, given the position it found itself in the 1930s, would it have been possible for the nationalist Chinese government to employ a small force of coastal submarines and small craft to keep at least the port of Guangzhou open, if not actively interfere with Japanese coastal movements? Or would it have been a better plan to abandon the sea and throw everything at building a competent riverine force? I mean, Japanese anti-submarine warfare efforts are nothing really to write home about, so coastal submarines might get away with some things, but overall Japanese superiority at sea would probably mean that if you did, you'd probably have a limited amount of success before the Japanese just roll in and shut down every possible place you could be basing these things out of in the areas that they're actually worried about. So, I mean, if someone's donating you coastal subs, then yeah, you probably could make a fairly good go at it for a few months, but it's not going to be a long-term campaign that will be sustainable. Curtis Boyer. It's probably you're right on the borderline of silly. Okay, fine. Instead of USS Johnston at the Battle of Samar, Johnston is an Atlanta-class cruiser. Captain Evans is still in command. Everything else is pretty much the same. Presumably even more stuff blows up, but I can see the Japanese perhaps realising they aren't facing fleet units because they might actually recognise the Atlanta class and extrapolate the other ship's size by comparison. Actually, I think the Battle of Samar will probably go worse. Precisely because they'd recognise the Atlanta for what it was, and because the Atlanta is just about big enough it might actually set off the armour-piercing shells inside the ship. So whereas the Johnston, when it was being hit by AP shells, would kind of collect a very interesting number of 8-inch, 14-inch and 18-inch holes in it, but without much, if anything, actually exploding aboard, an Atlanta class is probably just about big enough to set those off, especially the 8-inch shells, at which point it's going to get knocked out of action much, much faster than Johnston is. And, as you said, they're going to recognise it for what it is, and they're going to recognise what everything else is, so they're going to switch to HE. So, yeah, actually, having an Atlanta class instead of a Fletcher class as the Johnston at Samar probably means Samar ends very badly for a lot of US ships. Copying question. Right. Let me close that because I've finished that. Right, we're making headway. We are making headway. Ryan Gale, we're still on the Patreon questions. So, Ryan Gale, alternate history. What would have needed to happen for the entire Admiral class to be built and not just Hood? And if the Admirals were built, what names would the G3s and N3s use besides Lion, Temeraire, and Vanguard? If the Admirals were built, well, the G3s and N3s would probably use whatever names they were planning on using anyway, because the two of the Admiral names got stuck onto Nelson and Rodney, and yeah, so I don't think that's going to affect the naming conventions of the G3s and N3s. What are we going to look at though? What would it have needed to have happened for the entire Admiral class to be built? Faster design revisions post Jutland, because the thing that killed the Admiral class was that they had so many design revisions that would have moved them into basically being a subclass past Hood, that by the time they'd figured out everything they wanted to do with them and therefore were happy with the design, it was now also several years later, and they were looking around and going, well, actually, if we started from scratch, we could design a much more powerful battle cruiser. And indeed, there are some documents in the National Archives about a 1920 design battle cruiser that's kind of a halfway point between the Hoods and the G3s, which they briefly looked at before settling on the G3s. So for the entire Admiral class to be built is probably basically someone going, we need them as fast as humanly possible. Maybe they panic a little bit more about the Mackinsons, and so they just accept a few additional changes beyond Hood, but not much else, and then just try and speed build them. It would have made for very interesting negotiations at Washington, though, because the Admirals and with Hood would have been so much bigger than anything else that everyone else had. One HMS Hood on its own could kind of gently be shuffled around and ignored. An entire class of 4, that's not going to be something that anyone can ignore, so it's going to affect the conditions of the Washington Treaty one way or the other. Ross Richards asks, if the Fallout series technology develops very differently than it did in reality, as evidenced by the continued prevalence of the vacuum tube, developments in energy weapons and proliferation of nuclear power, what do you imagine the development of naval tech looking like in this world? Does the aircraft carrier still kill off the battleship, or does laser air defense weaponry mean that the battleship remains feasible? From what little I remember of playing some of the Fallout series, You probably end up with nuclear-powered battleships covered in lasers of all sorts and shapes and sizes. I don't recall that many aircraft in the Fallout series, to be honest. And given the whole kind of nuke punk tech setting of and with so many additional nuclear weapons around, I think they probably would have gone with, really heavily armoured nuclear-powered laser battleships, which is just a cool sentence to say. Paul Goyne, are there any books on the Imperial German Navy which, in your opinion, do a good job of covering things other than the Anglo-German rivalry? I know the German Admiralty must have had plans for war with France, war with Russia, and possibly even plans for colonial disputes in the Pacific with Japan or the US, but I've never found a book that discusses any of that. Oh. And of course, now he puts a picture in front of the German section, so I can't easily reference it. I mean, the Kaiser's Battle Fleet book, which I've recommended previously, does go into some of their other plans and the whys and wherefores of things. But to be perfectly honest, if you want a book that covers the Anglo-German rivalry, that covers the German stances other than the Anglo-German rivalry, you probably want a book that covers the Kaiserliche Marine pre-1900. And I'm trying to think. I know there's a few good articles that have been written about it. I can't think off the top of my head if there's been any books published specifically that cover the Imperial German Navy, sort of maybe up to the time of the Dreadnought or up to 1900. But that would be the kind of book I would look for, to be honest, because a lot of the early Imperial German stuff is actually quite interesting, and B, that's a lot more when they're looking at conflicts with other nations, whereas by the time you get into the 1900s, it's pretty much all looking at Tirpitz and his risk fleet strategy. Captain Soviet, it's July the 3rd, 1940. Instead of the French fleet being attacked at Mers el Kabir, it gets magically redistributed to the other major belligerent navies. What would the impact of having a pair of Dunkirks have on the other navies, and which navy would have the best use for them? Is everyone getting a pair of Dunkirks from that question? I think it's reading that way. Well, I mean, if everyone gets a pair of Dunkirks, so the Japanese are going to be jumping for joy because they've got another pair of fast battleship-battle cruiser things that they can use for running around the Pacific, along with the Congos, so they're going to have a lot of fun. Vintovka, by the way, in chat is recommending the book Dreadnought by Massey. It's probably actually a good choice, actually. I think my copy's also behind that picture. Copy out that question. So what were we talking about? Yeah, Dunkirks. So yeah, the Japanese would love to have a pair of Dunkirks. The Americans... What would the Americans do with a pair of Dunkirks? I mean, in 1940, the Americans would probably be quite happy to have a pair of Dunkirks as carrier escorts, but they're probably not going to be as overjoyed as the Japanese. The British are just going to be happy to have a pair of fast capital ships to hunt things with. The Italians are going to be very happy because, yeah, another pair of fast capital ships for them to chase the Royal Navy around the Mediterranean with. Although their fuel concerns, I don't know. No, I think the Italians would probably be fairly happy, at least for the first part of the war. I think everyone would be very happy to have them for their own purposes. The Germans would probably be looking at them going, oh, look, more fast commerce raiders to take with the Scharnhorsts. So I think everyone who's actively at war at that point would find some use for them very quickly. The Americans will probably look at them and go, nice carrier escorts. So they'd probably be the least impressed. Thomas Riley asks, what happens if the Yamato's actual design is discovered
early near the start of the war. Sanctions, slap on the wrist. Also able to view it again honest, or other countries withdrawing from and renegotiating treaties and building responses. If so, what? The treaty system had kind of collapsed before Yamato was really properly under construction. So finding out what they're doing isn't going to affect the treaties so much. What it might affect is what ships are building. So if it's discovered early enough, you'll probably see the Montanas get... well, the Montanas definitely will get greenlit. They may also go with some of the even larger Montana options that they were looking at. As far as the Germans and the Italians are concerned, well, the Japanese are their allies and they're on the other side of the world, so they're not too fussed. The British will almost certainly not cancel the Lions and probably will also start a crash course design in trying to figure out if they can get something bigger on the stocks pretty quickly. Yeah, because most people thought at the time that the Yamato was a 9/16-inch gun ship, like so many others that were being built at the time. So if they know exactly how big and how heavily armed it is, yeah, they're gonna have to build a response, the British and the Americans. Quite what that response is going to be, apart from the bigger versions of Montana, I'm not entirely sure, but they will build something. The British are probably the ones who are most likely to try and upscale the guns again, because they have a little bit more of a track record of doing that. The Americans will just go with even more 16-inch, well, 12 in the case of the longer, faster Montana they'd probably build. Because we're talking about 37, 38, something like that, back when they can actually make these plans. Chipster 8253. Alt history follow-up clarification. Regarding question I submitted 2 Drydocks ago, please allow me to clarify my supposed Kriegsmarine fleet. So I think this was an alternate Kriegsmarine fleet question. So no Bismarck interprets, no Deutschland class. So 6 Scharnhorst class with 3 twin 15-inch turrets apiece. Separate secondaries as usual. The Hippers would have the barbettes widened and slightly modified in construction to mount 4 twin 11-inch. Not the triples from the Scharnhorst. So effectively a slightly alternate version of Panzerschiff, except with 4 twin 11 instead of 2 triple. The entire surface fleet, knowing the invasion of Poland is going down on September 1939, sails from German ports a week before, so they're all at sea with full bunkers and full ammo loads. What does the Royal Navy do with 6 Scharnhorst class armoured 15-inch, 4 Hipper class supercruisers, assuming 11-inch guns are all of Scharnhorst rather than Deutschland type? Does it change the Battle of the Atlantic and possibly force Britain out of the war early? It is definitely going to change the Battle of the Atlantic, because now the Germans have a very large, powerful, fast force running around. The biggest differences are going to be whether or not they are together in one spot or not. If they scatter, it's going to be an absolute pain for the Royal Navy to hunt them all down, because they're not going to have enough fast ships to catch and kill those kinds of things. I mean, on paper, Hood could catch and kill one of them. Renown and Repulse might be able to, but they're not as well protected, so they'd be at a disadvantage, but they're at least playing in the same ballpark. And in 1939, that's literally it. The Dunkirks and Strasbourgs are good, but they're not good enough to take on Scharnhorst with 15-inch guns, unless it's 2v1. So even if you were super generous and said, okay, Renown and Repulse will get kind of divine blessing to win their engagements, and Hood wins it, and Dunkirk and Strasbourg double team another, there's still 2 Scharnhorsts out there, plus all the Hippers. Now the Hippers, if they're scattered, probably can be taken down, similar to the way Graf Spee was by cruiser squadrons. I wouldn't worry too much about those, but the Scharnhorst will be a major problem. Realistically, you're probably going to want to pair Renown and Repulse up if the Scharnhorst are split up, and if the Scharnhorst are operating in squadrons, you literally would have to put together Hood, Renown, Repulse, Dunkirk and Strasbourg as a 5-ship force
some of which are inferior to the Scharnhorsts, as the only force that can actually catch them. So you'd probably have to try and look for either trapping them or carrier striking them to slow them down, cripple them, or whatever, and then hit them with everything the Royal Navy has. So it would cause a lot of problems, but at the same time, sending them all out together into the Atlantic is a fairly major sign of what's going on. So the Royal Navy would probably be shadowing them with a lot of firepower. It really is a bit of a massive departure. So the Royal Navy would have to try and do something, but it would cause a lot of problems depending on exactly what kind of formation and rules of engagement they adopt in the months immediately following the outbreak of war. The main advantage the British would have, which, to be honest, is the fact that sooner or later the German ship was going to run out of fuel. Daniel Silverthorne, 1870. US Congress have placed you as head of the US Navy, concluding the post in 1910. You want to create a powerful US Navy able to rival any of the European powers and even pose a realistic threat to the Royal Navy. As such, Congress is alarmingly enthusiastic in approval of any and all ideas you might present them. With all the knowledge you possess, including all future knowledge, how would you enact this plan for Congress to improve the US Navy to major power status on the world stage between 1870 and 1910? What ships would you develop and have built, in what numbers, and are there any particular personnel you promote or terminate or encourage to develop certain technologies while under your guidance? I mean, Admiral Sims is an obvious one. He reformed US gunnery historically, so keep him around, get him to start earlier. Using future knowledge and knowing which conflicts the US is going to get involved in, I would focus most of my presumably much larger budget during the 1870s, 1880s into massively upgrading my infrastructure. So dockyards, gun foundries, armour manufacturers, etc. I'd keep a small but steady stream of ironclads coming to refine technologies and get operational experience up. But I wouldn't go all in, because during that period naval technology is advancing so much. Even if I built a massive fleet in 1870, I'm going to have to build another massive fleet in 1880 because the 1870 fleet is going to be obsolete. Then, knowing that the Spanish-American War is probably brewing up towards the end of the 1890s, at the beginning to mid-1890s, I'd then put together a fairly nice solid set of armoured cruisers and pre-dreadnought battleships. Use that to walk over the Spanish Armada in the Spanish-American War, and then go back to refining my technology, widening the experience, probably building a reasonable fleet of fairly powerful cruisers for my fleet screen, because again, destroyer technology and battleship technology is about to take a massive shift, so there's no point wasting time and money. And then that way I should, when HMS Dreadnought is launched and everything kicks off, I should have a fairly nice fleet screen of decent protected light cruisers, a reasonable sized experienced fleet of pre-dreadnoughts and other ships, and I would then have a massive amount of infrastructure ready to just go absolute ham on constructing a massive fleet of dreadnoughts, along with the appropriate fleet screen, battle cruisers, etc. Yeah, and that would be the way I do it, because then by the time you get to World War One, everyone's going to be exceptionally worried about this gigantic Doom fleet that I've just cranked out using my sort of artificially time-accelerated shipbuilding infrastructure. He also asked, will we ever get video series of building models with Drydock to include naval and non-naval subjects? Maybe. I've got plenty of models to build and paint. I need to find some kind of screen or low table that I can film on that's not a grey carpet, though. I mean, to be honest, I am in the middle of building a big 6x4 naval harbour setup for dystopian wars. So maybe I should do a fun Friday covering the building of that, at which point that means I should actually probably start taking photos of it while I'm building it, rather than just doing it in the conservatory when it's not, -6. Jim Smitty asks, In October 1939, Kriegsmarine is commissioning its first Elektroboot, the Type 23. They aren't sure this is a good idea, as they aren't putting all their eggs in one basket as they're testing ships. However, with war being declared and the boat and its sister boat being forced to go on war patrols, I figure after a number of successful war patrols, the Kriegsmarine would see these boats as good for niche roles, namely warship hunting. They decide to make a larger counterpart to these, the Type 21, for use in the North Atlantic, to allow the Type 7s and 9s range at merchant without getting hit by escorts. However, action-reaction, how does this affect Allied anti-submarine warfare efforts? I mean, assuming that they're building these advanced electroboats in 1930 and 1940, and they're somehow advancing the technology that was used in them, sort of advancing their technological base by 3 or 4 years, there's not an awful lot the Allies can do, to be perfectly honest, because if you've got acoustic homing torpedo-equipped submarines that are actually faster underwater than the things like the Flower class that the Royal Navy is churning out, you're pretty hard-pressed to stop them. The main way the Allies would react, I suspect, would probably be they'd be forced into building sloops and destroyer escorts that are faster still. Probably they're mass manufacturing them anyway, but so they'd have to advance that. They'd probably have to go a lot more active with ASDIC as well. And I think that they would be also forced into doing something like the merchant aircraft carriers or similar very, very quickly. They might even be forced to stopgap some older carriers like Eagle, Argus, or Hermes in as convoy escorts until the merchant aircraft carriers can get converted. But assuming that these submarines are actually complete in 39 and don't have various problems, there's not an awful lot the Allies can do in the immediate term. Class A Cornet. Would the Japanese have been better off building modified Amagis Nelson style rather than rebuilding the Congos? Well, they're still under the treaty systems. Oh, I see, building a Nelson. If they're going to break the treaties earlier, if they can get the speed up, which they probably could given 1930s propulsion tech, given that they're leaving the treaty system anyway, then yeah, probably. I mean, a modified Nelson-style Amagi is going to have more firepower and better protection than the Congos, although having better protection than the Congos is not exactly the world's most difficult accomplishment. And they probably could still keep the Congos around as anti-aircraft escorts for their carriers or something like that. So, yeah, they probably would have been better off, but quite how they'd managed to find the resources to justify breaking the treaties is another problem. How are we doing? About 2/3 of the way through the Patreon questions. Hugh Fisher asks, alternate history, Battle of Sibian Sea and San Bernardino Strait, Brit style. It's due to logistics issues with the Normandy landings. The US reconquest of the Philippines has been delayed to 44. Oh, yes, this one. Okay, so basically, Task Force 38 has been decoyed away as off doing something important. Older US battleships are guarding Surigao Strait. So when Yamato, Musashi, and the Leyte Gulf Japanese battle force sail, Nimitz signals the newly arrived British Pacific Fleet to take care of it. What does the British Pacific Fleet do? So you've got Yamato, Musashi, Kongo, Haruna, 6 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyer squadrons. The British Pacific Fleet has whatever they have at the time. So this is December 44, plus any Allied contributions like Saratoga. The British Pacific Fleet probably slightly panics, although they would also relish the opportunity. Now, although the British Pacific Fleet of maybe March 45 could quite easily take them. Give me 2 secs. I just need to check a book which I know will tell me exactly what ships they had in that time, but it's going to be a lot less. There we go. Right, so, yeah. British Pacific Fleet by David Hobbs. Very useful reference work. No, I don't want to know pennant numbers. There we go. Composition of the British Pacific Fleet in January 1945. Okay, January, it's not December, but close enough. The problem is, like, Richelieu's gone back for a refit at this point, as have quite a lot of other battleships. So you've got carriers: Indefatigable, Illustrious, Victorious, Indomitable. Battleships: King George V and Howe. Cruisers: Swiftsure, Gambia, Black Prince, Argonaut, and Euryalus. Destroyers: Quickmatch, Quiberon, Quality, Queensborough, Grenville, Ulster, Undine, Ursa, Urania, Undaunted, Kempenfelt, Wessex, Wager, Whelp, Whirlwind, and Wakeful. Bunch of little escorts and frigates and sloops, plus 4 escort carriers, 2 repair ships, HMS Unicorn, a destroyer depot ship, and a net layer. So yeah, they're not going to be taking the Japanese fleet on in straight-on combat. They've only got 2 battleships there. The King George V's are nice. The King George V's are not going to take on Yamato, Musashi, Kongo, and Haruna, and Nagato for that matter. Also cruisers. You're outnumbered 5 to 6, and none of those cruisers are heavy. Destroyers. I think the destroyers would probably quite happily take on the Japanese destroyers and any Japanese cruisers that got in the way without much of a problem. But I think the strength of the British response is probably going to be in the carriers. So if the entire the British, we're assuming the British Pacific Fleet is actually there, because obviously this is completely a historical scenario. But assuming that they're in the vicinity, I suspect the British Pacific Fleet's main thrust of operations would be to use every carrier they've got, including those small escort carriers acting as ferries and Unicorn, to launch absolutely everything they've got, probably into a dusk airstrike, because they can do the whole fleet can do night ops, and it'll degrade Japanese anti-aircraft gunnery performance somewhat, and probably then try to keep hitting them. In fact, yeah, they'd try for a massed airstrike. Obviously, we're using Barracudas and Avengers at this point, and Seafires and such like. So probably mass airstrike in the evening. There'll be enough light for them to tell roughly what the result is. If that goes well, then go to step 2. If it doesn't go quite as well as they planned, refuel, rearm, launch another strike, this time fully in the night. And step 2 would be to probably put the destroyers forward first, followed by the cruisers and battleships. And once you've damaged, destroyed, etc., various Japanese ships, you then use the fact that the Royal Navy at this point is pretty much all equipped with radar, and go in for a deep night attack to pick off survivors. So basically hit the Japanese as hard as you can with 1, possibly 2 carrier strikes, and then try and roll up scattered formations with the whole of the fleet, probably using lots of destroyers with torpedo attacks going in first. So I'd imagine you'd probably have the destroyers skirmishing with the Japanese destroyers, and then you probably have like the Didos rolling in right behind to offer point fire support, and then the bigger Crown colonies, etc., coming in behind that as well. That would then allow you to force through onto, once you've taken care of the destroyers, force through onto the enemy cruisers, who'd presumably be coming up to help the destroyers. Then you have the numbers advantage. And you probably have King George V and Howe following at that point, coming up behind to help finish off any cruisers, although you'd have to be careful of long lances, at which point you'd be reliant on a mixture of your own shipboard radar and flying radar-equipped fleet air arm aircraft to report on where any surviving Japanese battleships are. and then you wouldn't want to just go after all of them. You'd probably, I mean, let's face it, you'd be very, very unfair. You wait till about 1 a.m. once the Japanese crews are utterly exhausted from multiple air attacks and destroyer attacks and the ships are damaged, and then you focus on them one by one. So if Yamato's had to break formation and go one way, you mob it with everything you've got, reduce it to a flaming wreck, and then move on. Basically what they did to Bismarck, except rinse and repeat for however many of them are still afloat. But it's going to be a very, very difficult fight, because if the airstrikes don't go off as well as they need to, the British Pacific Fleet of December 44 does not have the firepower to stand toe-to-toe with that force immediately. Fast forward a few months, and that's an entirely different story, but that's a very specific time period that's given in the question. The games player by the signal flag there, that is the Bravo Zulu flag set. Brett Paulson, have you ever read The Great Pacific War by Bywater? If so, do you think he got it right for how a US versus Japan confrontation would have played out had it begun in the 1920s? This is one of the early alternate history novels. It is, as the question suggests, a US v Japan alternate history written in the 1920s. I haven't read it. It is on my list of books to acquire at long term to read, but I don't. I haven't read it at this point in time, unfortunately. But maybe at some point during this coming year, I'll get a chance to. You never know. Cody asks, Drac, how would you design an escort or pocket battleship? I wouldn't, because they're awful ideas. If someone put a gun to my head and said you have to design one, I would take the escort battleship idea, at which point, what would I do? Probably something in the region of 25,000 tons. Give it a couple of triple or quad guns at a reasonable caliber, maybe 14 or 15 inch. Just something with six. So you've either got 6 or 8 14 or 15 inch guns, enough to be a credible threat to most things that come your way, but you're not developing massive amounts of displacement towards lots and lots of guns, or having 16-inch guns or whatever. And then I'd probably do it Nelson style or Richelieu style, technically, so guns all forward, and that would allow me to cover the entire rear deck with anti-aircraft weaponry, and the sides as well, and anti-aircraft guns on top of the turrets. So basically make it a gigantic floating anti-aircraft farm that also coincidentally happens to have the ability to shoot back occasionally if enemy ships get in the way. But that would probably be about as far as I'd take it. They'd almost be escort battle cruisers, to be honest, because I think if they're running escorts for the aircraft carriers, if you're in a position where you're fighting enemy capital ships, something's already gone massively, massively wrong. So enough armor to deal with heavy cruisers and destroyers, but that would be where the weight savings I'd get to fit those guns onto something 25 to 30,000 tons probably. Texas and LaShock asks, what are some of the snarkier signs or reminders posted on warships? For example, on the AA guns of the Alabama, there's a note reading, lead, damn it, lead. There's a lot of... snarky signs don't tend to last very long on warships because officers keep taking them down, irritatingly enough. Reminders and such that are posted mostly in forms of chalk graffiti can be quite interesting, but given that this is naval stuff we're talking about, especially World War I, World War II, Most of the ones I'm aware of probably shouldn't be repeated on a live stream unless I really, really like YouTube coming in and shutting everything down. But at some point, I do have a video on naval humour coming up, so I don't know when I'm going to actually end up completing that one, but when I do, I will include some of the more interesting ones. There's actually an awful lot of interesting stuff that was chalked onto main guns, for example. I can't remember which ship it was, but I do remember seeing. It's a ship with a triple turret. I mean, that doesn't narrow it down too much in the context of World War II, but I do remember seeing a ship with a triple turret where the starboard side gun, which was the one that was closest to the photo, someone had chalked on "enemy this way" with a big arrow pointing towards the muzzle. So just copying another question. Unemployed history major. Titanic slows down, avoids collision with iceberg, survives until 1914. The Royal Navy presses her into service as an auxiliary cruiser. Build the most powerful auxiliary cruiser you can out of the RMS Titanic. For this, you can actually look at RMS Olympic, which was relatively heavily armed, and is obviously Titanic's sister ship. That's gonna... Yeah, Darius Rukowski, consult the jingles about Navy humour. That's probably a good idea. Yeah, auxiliary cruiser Titanic. Well, from Olympic, we know that Titanic would have had, and also from the plans, we know Titanic could have mounted multiple 6-inch guns. I think if I remember correctly, Olympic had 6 6-inch guns. Plus Catfish 552 text on NASA's shuttle carrier, attach orbiter here, black side down. And I think it had some 4-inch and 3-inch guns fore and aft. Olympic did in a previous refit before it had the 6-inch. So I think if you were gonna reasonably build Titanic as into its most powerful auxiliary cruiser form, you'd probably be looking at something with 8 to 10 single 6-inch guns and probably a broadside of 5 or so. If you wanted to go absolutely silly with it, then those are Titanic portholes. Probably stick with maybe 4 or 5 6-inch guns on top, and then maybe convert the first class cabins in and the portholes into gun ports for a Age of Sail style broadside, where you just use 12-pounders or 3-inch guns, and just have ridiculous numbers. Basically, turn it into HMS Victory II. Not entirely sure what you do with that. I mean, it'd be very well concealed, but maybe use it as bait. Maybe use it as a giant Q ship for German merchant raiders. And then you have a kind of Pirates of the Caribbean scene where it just suddenly runs out all these guns and starts blazing away with a massive broadside. It would probably become a tinderbox to make a British battlecruiser at Jutland proud, but that would be the most powerful you could probably do with it. Samuel Samuelson, why didn't Japan do more to destroy the Panama Canal in World War II? If you'd been in charge of the Imperial Fleet, how would you have destroyed it? Basically, they lacked the ability to. And by the time they had the ability to, in the form of some of their extreme long-range submarines, the Americans had heavily fortified it to the point that such a mission would have been near enough suicidal. If I personally had been in charge of the Imperial Fleet at the beginning of World War II... Okay. Bit of an off-the-cuff idea, but it might work. Get 2 of the single biggest submarines the Japanese Navy has. They don't have the I-400s at this point, but get 2 of the biggest subs they have. remove pretty much all offensive weaponry, torpedoes, etc. Skeleton crew on both, extra fuel tanks, stage them out of on some route somewhere where they can refuel from a mothership and resupply from a mothership somewhere in the mid-Pacific, and basically do an HMS Campbelltown where one of the subs is basically skeleton crew, fuel, and as much explosive as you can possibly pack into the thing. And then sail both subs up there, and because it's the beginning of World War II, so kamikazes aren't quite a thing yet, have it basically sail this first submarine pre-start of hostilities right up to the first set of lock gates you can find, crew jump off, run off into the Panamanian jungle or whatever with a short timer set, detonates the sub, blows up the locks, or the lock gates, and then they try and get back on board the other submarine and make it home. That would be my main way of doing things. Of course, yeah, you might persuade them to just kamikaze straight in, at which point you can load up 2 subs like that, and just in case one of them fails. But or, to be perfectly honest, if you are going to do kamikaze, go for it big time. Send a come up with some vaguely plausible reason as to why you might be sending a massive amount of grain or coal or something to some nation on the Atlantic, and then load up a really big cargo ship with explosives with a thin covering of grain or coal or whatever your cargo is, and just sail that into the worst possible place along the Panama Canal that you could where you could set off an explosion and blow it up there. That would probably do a lot of damage. But as I say, the Japanese weren't quite as into the kamikaze thing at the beginning of the war as they would be later on. So, yeah, the main thing would be with the explosive-laden cargo ship would be whether or not the US would demand, the Panama Canal Authority would demand to inspect it first, which might give the game away. But if you make it a big enough boom, then it might not matter. Maybe equip it with some underwater torpedo tubes just in case. Robert Henry Ilston. Roosevelt is able to convince the American people of the German threat well before Pearl Harbor, results being several military programs are accelerated, including the Iowas. When Bismarck sets sail, she is met not by Hood and her task force, but by Missouri and a task force analogous to that with Hood. What ships would you see alongside Missouri, and how would the battle go if you remove the Golden BB that Bismarck shot into Hood? Well, if Missouri is taking Hood's place and the Americans are sending a force analogous to that which Admiral Holland had with him, so that would mean taking a South Dakota or a North Carolina, at which point, well, an Iowa and a South Dakota or North Carolina against Bismarck and Prince Eugen is a little bit of a one-sided engagement, to be perfectly honest. Because you've affected, yeah, I mean, the only thing would be if they're just taking the place of Hood and Prince of Wales, then, well, yeah, 2 16-inch armed ships will do a lot better against Bismarck and Prince Eugen than Prince of Wales and Hood did, assuming all fire control systems, etc., are equal. But yeah, that's a fairly open and shut case, to be perfectly honest. Missouri on her own versus Bismarck and Prince Eugen might be quite interesting, because Missouri is undeniably the superior vessel, but she has at least one ship. She has one ship basically having free fire conditions on her, which could lead to things like broken fire control systems, which might then push her into a position of having to break off the engagement because she can't accurately shoot back. At which point the whole thing's basically on a timer of can she hit and kill her first target before the other ship hits her hard enough to knock out her more vulnerable systems. Miko Leitner, could the inclusion of the Japanese hybrid carrier battleships to the Operation Tengo fleet make any kind of difference to the outcome? Not really. Well, I say that. If both Issei and Hyuga were with the Operation Tengo fleet, there would be two very large targets with some additional anti-aircraft firepower. And I suppose if you loaded them with fighters as well. The thing is, in those kind of circumstances, there are just so many American fighters that even if you fully loaded Issei and Hyuga with their own fighter craft, there's more than enough American fighters to deal with them without significantly impeding the American strike aircraft. Their main effect would be, well, one, they'd slow down the Tengo fleet somewhat, but once they do, and once the engagement starts, as I say, they are two very big targets. So if they position themselves between the American strike aircraft and Yamato, Yamato might survive maybe it might take 3 or 4 waves to put Yamato down. And whether or not there's enough daylight to do that, or they have to come back the next day to finish it off, is another question. But that would be purely through Issei and Hyuga just eating up incoming torpedoes. The Senkari asks, that's a modern question. I mean, yeah, carte blanche to shape the Navy as you see fit. What are your priorities for the Royal Navy looking forward until 2040? That involves a modern question with modern politics. So, yeah, don't think I really want to answer that, to be perfectly honest. Might answer that in a Discord chat or something random, but as you know, channel policy, not past 1950 in less exceptional circumstances. Bill Brockman, have you read From Damn Neck to Okinawa by Robert E. Wallace? He was an AA training officer in places like Bermuda and then in charge of automatic weapons on USS Idaho. I thought he was very thoughtful in his approach to aiming and firing 20 and 40mm batteries. I haven't, so that's another book I need to add to my reading list. Yeah, there are so many good books about World War II. You would take a lifetime to read them all. And by the time you finish, people produce a whole bunch more, so it's a never-ending task. Maximilian Hubert, the second attempt by the Austro-Hungarian Navy to force the Otranto barrage is not spotted by an Italian MAS boat, and SMS St. Esteban is not sunk. What damage could the fleet do to the Allied forces, and would it have any influence on the further course of the war in this theatre? By June 1918, it's not really going to have all that much effect. But the actual Otranto barrage itself, they would sweep away relatively easily. There weren't particularly heavy forces waiting at it. What it would do is provoke a fairly significant counterstrike by the Italian and French naval forces. Although, to be perfectly honest, given how much time they spent swinging at anchor, the Austro-Hungarian fleet's not in the best state in June 1918, so it would provoke a bit of a fight, and there definitely would be fairly significant losses on both sides, because especially for the Austro-Hungarian forces, they're all there. The Allied forces coming to counterattack would either be feeding in piecemeal or be letting them run rampant for a while until they can build up a big enough force in one place. So its main influence is probably going to be at the negotiating table, largely in the form of everyone who's lost ships demanding Austro-Hungarian ships as compensation. Colin Williams, what naval relic do you most desire to own that could be realistically obtained for a private collection? Yeah, realistically obtained, because otherwise, yeah, 15-inch guns. Naval relic would I most desire to own? See, the thing is, I've already got one of those brass gun turrets made from the brass of HMS Rodney. That's actually a very good question. In terms of general naval, I don't know if you call it relics or such, probably the thing that jumps to mind the most is that there are some modern replicas as well, but I know back in the day there were some really nice fully working scale models of naval and coastal defense guns. I think they're made by a German company, but that's that's one of the things I've always wanted to own that's naval related, because you've got like the full turntable, all the gearing, the training, the elevation, etc., and the chamber is because being a 1910 era thing, the chamber can also be fired with projectiles and caps. So it is actually, technically speaking, a functioning weapon. Although you're never going to really hurt much with it, but it's still a cool thing. Poke a few holes in cardboard. Okay, so, oh, wow, right, we've only got 4 Patreon questions left before we get to, Nigel Rhodes suggests Nelson's hat. Yes, I think there'd be a lot of blue uniformed people at the door in short order if I somehow ended up with Nelson's hat, because there'd be an empty space in the National Maritime Museum and a lot of very difficult questions. Kaiju Director says, I sound like a Bond villain. I don't have a white cat. And I have more hair than Blofeld. At least for the minute. So, let's get on with these, and then we can get through these super chats and then into regular chat. Right. Tillman question. Alternate history Tillman question. Who's this from? I somehow managed to lose who it's from. Very sorry about that, but never mind. You'll recognise the questions anyway, at least, hopefully. What would be the most powerful ship you think a Tillman would beat or is equal with, assuming it's Tillman 4-2? The Tillman 4-2 with the 24 16-inch guns, I don't think anyone ever built a ship that could beat that thing in a gunfight. As far as realistic Tillmans go, some of the earlier ones with, say, 12 16-inch guns are kind of maybe a slightly more ambitious vessel than the original 1920 South Dakotas, so they're probably the most practical. Black Hawk DVs. I'm surprised you wouldn't want a ship's bell. Yeah, again, most ship's bells that survive and are around in, like, above the surface are in museums, so not realistically ownable, unfortunately. That was the qualifier there. Yeah, I don't know if a gerbil is loose or not. I haven't heard anything fall over for a while, so maybe he's gone back into his tank. I don't know. And how much would a Tillman or two have affected the Washington and London treaties? Quite significantly. It's not going to be anywhere near as good a conversion for a carrier because it's a battleship, not a battle cruiser. Basically, anyone who completes a really big battleship pre-Washington is going to face the problem of either having to allow everyone else to complete 1 or 2 themselves, which is basically what happened with the 16-inch gunships, or they're going to have to scrap something they put an awful lot of time and money into. Paul from Chicago asks, I will tell you what he asks when I can call the window back up again. Oh yes, this one. What happened to the MV Derbyshire? Why was the Court of Inquiry so unusual? I had to look into this. So the MV Derbyshire, or Derbyshire, depending on which part of the UK you're from, was a fairly substantial substantial vessel, a cargo carrying vessel that disappeared in a typhoon, and they took them a while to find the wreck as well. So I'm just looking at the notes I came up with for this. Yeah, so Derbyshire went down without a distress call. Other ships of her class were lost, following cracks found in the deck, which seems to indicate that it was probably something of a contributing factor. She was in a typhoon, so yeah, deck cracking is probably a problem. As far as the Court of Inquiry was concerned, I didn't really find much about that. Why was the Court of Inquiry so unusual? Yeah, to be honest, I wasn't quite able to find a fantastic amount about the Derbyshire, other than it was a big ship. It sank probably through poor design in a typhoon. So, yeah. I'd say to be perfectly honest, because I'm not really able to furnish all that much detail on the ship in question. I'd probably say Paul, that you've earned yourself a second question at some point this month. Sorry, turns out I can't answer everything. Just copying out a few of the super chat questions there. M Flash asks, what would there have been a different outcome at the first Battle of Narvik if the Tribals had gone in instead of the H class with their greater firepower? Was going to ask Dr. Clark this one, but any mention of Tribals? Yes, fair enough. Different outcome at the first Battle of Narvik if the Tribals had gone in. Probably fewer of them would have been lost, because the German torpedoes were malfunctioning quite badly, so that much wouldn't have been a problem. But if the Tribals had gone in instead of the H's, then instead of the H's being outgunned when the various German destroyers started to respond, the German responding destroyers would have been severely outgunned. At which point there may not have been a second Battle of Narvik. I mean, with destroyer fights, everything can be very random. Destroyer fights are one of those things where technological or firepower superiority should, in theory, make a significant difference, but it also might not, because there's a huge amount of just random chance, because they're not armoured ships, so a lucky shot is much more likely when you're talking about destroyer versus destroyer engagement. But theoretically, on paper, the Tribals should have been able to mop up pretty much all the German destroyers they came up against, in which case there probably wouldn't be a second Battle of Narvik, or realistically, if you include the German takeout of the Norwegian ships, a third, which means that we wouldn't get the wonderful sight of Warspite sailing up a fjord and blowing up everything in sight. So yeah, that probably would have been the short outcome, at least on paper, as I say. Things could always go slightly wrong. My screen is deciding it's going to turn itself off again, so I'm going to have to temporarily disappear to tell my screen that no, in fact, I do not want it to turn off. Also, it's getting incredibly warm in here, so I'm going to ditch the fleece. Okay. Last two questions before we go on to the super chats and then the regular chats from everyone else. Sliced bread. Admiral Drek assumes command of the Royal Navy shipbuilding and development in 1919. He had a dozen maintenance-free naval nuclear reactors that fell off the back of a lorry and a friend of a friend in East London, which you can get him the fuel for cheap. No other tech transfers, knowledge of coming events, etc. are permitted by the Time Police. What ships get the reactors and why? Is this just a way of avoiding bunkering fuel, or does it lead to significant capability changes? Well, if you're talking about basically giving unlimited range to ships, if I've got a few dozen, well, immediately the solution that lends itself is for a few dozen, put them in all the capital ships. And then I've got some spare and left over. What would I do with a few dozen? Keep them around for future capital ships, to be perfectly honest. Because at that point, if you've removed the issue of range and fuel consumption, then not only have your capital ships now got the ability to cruise around at basically forever, which make things like hunting down Bismarck much easier in the future, but you've also got your fleet to a point where they also don't have to worry about sort of point speed runs. They can just go at high speed all over the place. So you've vastly increased the tactical capability of the Royal Navy. You're not going to get nuclear reactors into a destroyer, so don't even try. And whilst a few dozen is nice, it's not enough to fit out the entire cruiser fleet. So yeah, I'd refit all the capital ships and keep a bunch around for future capital ships and carriers, which will make everyone else very jealous. Lily asked this question with a note that says, please give this question a reading with the appropriate dramatic intonation. Very well. HMCS Sackville versus HMS Victory. And how much does the battle change if Victory has a priest of Poseidon clad in naught but fishing nets on the forecastle, shouting whilst he brandishes a trident to magically change the winds to suit her needs? Also, have you covered naval myths that are most annoying? Oh dear. I mean, Sackville versus Victory. Sackville can engage Victory beyond Victory's effective and indeed any combat range. So Sackville would win the default engagement. If you're talking about with the aforementioned random priest of merciful Poseidon, then if he can change the wind to suit her needs, I mean, the Sackville's not going to be particularly stable in particularly high and nasty winds and driving storms, which is always going to be a bad thing for them. So Victory might win that one purely by dint of completely disabling Sackville's ability to fight and then getting close enough for a boarding action. So it took us 2 hours that time to reach the end of the Patreon questions. Now I've got to go back over all the various super chats, but we're getting there. Sixtus Beckmesser says, military history not visualized recently has a vid discussing luck at Midway. Recommended. Yes, definitely go and have a check out of that. Definitely check that. It's a very good video. So, going back over the super chat questions that popped up during this time. 50 TNSCSA is saying, I've played enough Age of Empires to know that the priest could just convert Victory. Good point. Yes, of course. Well, yeah, Age of Empires 1, Ancient Greece, Priest of Poseidon. So yeah, he's just going to be standing there going, Wallow, Wallow. And then you hear, Oh dear. Right. Gold Picard asks, my question revolves around your retelling of the Franklin and her valorous crew's efforts to keep her afloat. I understand the reason why it had to be removed. Any update on its return? I need to completely revise the script to avoid the same thing happening again. That's all I'll say on that for the minute, but probably towards the end of next year. I have ordered a bunch more additional books from completely different authors, so it will cover the Franklin, so I'll be able to use those. But at the moment, they're somewhere over the ocean. Who knows where? I mean, it's Christmas - New Year's post, but the post has been especially bad for obvious reasons in recent times. But yes, you will get a new USS Franklin video at some point next year. And if you're really, really lucky, and if the whole, COVID situation decides to sort itself out, I might be able to go and actually, well, obviously Franklin doesn't exist anymore, but I might be able to visit one of the other Essex-class carriers in the USA and sort of demonstrate exactly where everything was happening using that vessel as a stand-in. Drydock 95 asks, as a gunsmith, I'm curious if you know if the rifling for battleship guns was single point cut or if they were cut in broaches or other tooling. I think I mentioned in a previous Drydock that the cutting the rifling for the battleship guns was one of the most difficult tasks, because it was basically done as one long exercise, and once it started they couldn't stop. At least that's what I've read in a number of sources about naval gun foundries at the time. So yeah, they had a... I can't I'm looking around for a naval rifle cutter. It's like, I don't have one of those. I don't even know if any of them even exist, but basically they had specific tooling that they would approach the barrel with, and it would begin the cut, and that would be kind of, now we are cutting the rifling, and if we screw this up, we have completely wrecked the gun. So it would take a very long time. Steve A. Oh, yes, when you say next year, I'm still stuck in 2020. Later 2021. I'm kind of hoping that if everything works out and the stars align, that I might be able to make it over to the US for August. There's no way the COVID situation is going to be sorted by Easter, but August might be okay. For those of you wondering what happened to the Franklin video, there is a pinned post in the Discord general chat, but I really don't want to talk about it because it mainly just makes me angry. So, yeah. Someone points out Yorktown has a model of Franklin when she was damaged. So that, yeah, Tyler Kennedy, thank you. So that might be a very useful thing. If I can make it to Yorktown, because then I can show the model, and I can also walk around the ship and go, and that would have been equivalent placed here. Donkey Boy says, I think Ryan from Battleship New Jersey channel speaks about cutting the grooves in the guns. Yes, I think he does. If you do get a chance, have a look at the Battleship New Jersey channel. They have a lot of very interesting, very good content, and it does help them out because, of course, the poor old New Jersey is struggling a little bit at the moment, trying to keep open. Nozdormu89, did the Soviet Navy have any significant achievements in World War II? More than you'd think, given most popular history. They didn't have any major massive battles, but their later war, their submarine campaign against the Germans, was quite effective, even if it did also occasionally result in some rather nasty incidents like the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff. Basically an evacuee liner. I don't think they necessarily knew it was, but it was still a horrible tragedy one way or the other. And then other achievements. Especially in the, get it right, the Black Sea, they actually had quite a interesting and heroic series of efforts supplying places like Sevastopol by sea, and they lost a fair number of ships doing that. But and of course there was the riverborne gunboats that they used. So yeah, they didn't have any big battles like the sinking of Bismarck or Scharnhorst or Battle of Cape Matapan or anything like that. But the Soviet Navy was definitely working quite hard during the Second World War. So I'd say, yeah, their achievements were more kind of cumulative rather than big one-offs. Ben Grogan, what advantage do pump jets have over props, considering their prevalence on modern subs? What stops their use on surface vessels? Pump jets over props, stealth, some efficiency. But it's with pump jets on subs, it's mainly for the stealth issues. What stops their use on surface vessels? Mainly the fact that a sub is very, very much underwater, so you can have the whole kind of shroud and everything on a submarine. On a surface ship, that tends to get in the way a lot more, and obviously the props are actually quite close to the surface a lot of the time. Yankee Clipper mentioning Battleship Cove. Yes, Battleship Cove is on my list. I may have to revise my planned tour list depending on when I manage to make it to the US, depending on what's open. Well, both what's open in terms of methods of transport and what's open in terms of what ships are actually open at the time. But if anything, I will probably be looking to try and expand it slightly in terms of visiting more ships, or possibly expanding it slightly in terms of visiting the same kind of number of ships and museums, but at a slightly more relaxed rate, because when I was planning it last time, I obviously had to worry about annual leave from work, from the day job, and so I was having to cram absolutely everything I could into a 2-week period. But obviously going into this year, I'm not going to have to worry about that. So as long as I can build up enough of a video back catalogue and have them all scheduled for release, I can theoretically take as long as I need, and as on the tour, and as to be honest, as long as Mrs. Drac will actually let me go. But yeah, so I have a little bit more freedom in that regard this time round. Max Irata suggests that descriptions of battles should have animations of ship movements instead of static maps. Yeah, except that I would love it, except for one major thing. I'm a one-man band. It's like when you see a video, all the video editing, obviously the recording, the research, absolutely everything is done by me. Okay, there is no other video editor, there is no graphics person, etc. This is all just what I'm able to do. I don't have the skills to even come close to someone like Montemayor in his graphics editing, or indeed someone like Baz Battles or Historiograph or any of those other ones. Now, I don't know offhand whether they use they hire people to do those animations, or whether they're good enough to do them themselves. I know Military History Visualized does those animations himself, but then he has the proper qualifications to do that. So we shall see what happens with that. But yeah, when I learn how to do graphics like that, then sure, I'll include them. But until that point, it's a little bit difficult. Old Contemptible asks, what will you do for money after being economized? Well, as I've said before, the day job did pay pretty well. They're still going through the bureaucracy, obviously, at the minute, but that'll all be sorted probably in the next few weeks. So I have some money saved up, and the channel makes enough to keep the lights on. So as long as I'm careful, I will be able to use my reserves to grow the channel, which obviously in theory will then hopefully allow, because as I've said before, in the Drydock where I mentioned that my position will no longer exist once the bureaucracy and the paperwork has been sorted. Ideally, I want all the money that the channel makes to go back into the channel, so acquiring naval photographs, doing research trips, etc., etc. But when it comes down to it, and this is something I wasn't able to say before because I didn't know it before, but they're doing the classic old bait and switch technique at my where I theoretically currently work, which is they're deleting a bunch of positions and then they are re-advertising positions whose job title is different, but whose job description is suspiciously similar to a bunch of the positions they've deleted, only incorporates work done by 2 or more previous positions, and are also on lower pay. So in my particular case, technically, when my position is formally and completely deleted, technically I have the option to apply for basically my job, but 2 pay grades lower, and doing the work of both me and my assistant, who I have at the moment, who's also having his position deleted. Yeah, you can take 2 guesses at what my reaction was to, yeah, you can come back and work for us, do double the work, and about 25% less pay. Yeah, no. I have some self-respect. Certainly more than they seem to think I have. Anyway. Nick Poshek asked, what ship do you think is worst represented in World of Warships? For me, I think King George V is quite underrated by the stats it was given. Basically, any ship that historically was more heavily biased towards armour than anything else. Because, and this is my one big bugbear with World of Warships, if anyone asks me what was the one thing I would change, this is it. Basically what they've done is they've got the gun penetration values historically stretched out over the appropriate ranges, but they've artificially shortened the engagement ranges. So in a typical battleship duel in World War II, you'd be fighting at 15 to 25,000 yards, when sort of gunfire would start in the mid to high 20s and then gradually draw down. And so let's say 20,000 yards as an average, so you're talking about 19 kilometers. And so yeah, look, if you think about that, think about playing in World of Warships. A lot of battleships in World of Warships don't have a range of 18 to 19 kilometers, and you'd have to be absolutely insane to try and fight an entire battle at that range. But that's the range at which their armor schemes are designed to work. If you then go and fight at 5, 6, 8 kilometers, you're fighting at sub 10,000 yards. As far as battleships are concerned with armor penetration, that's basically knife fighting range, at which point armor flat out doesn't work most of the time. And because they haven't scaled back the armor penetration to take account of the scaled back engagement ranges, any ship that historically did put a lot of its displacement into protection as opposed to just raw firepower ends up getting the short end of the stick. And yeah, there are some ships that have much longer ranges than that, but when was the last time you ever saw anyone fighting at them? Luce, do you think War Thunder Naval is accurate enough to do reenactments of battles in the game? If you've got bots to do it, sure. The main problem I have, as I said, that I have with War Thunder Naval, or I did when I played it, was the completely manual changes in range that you had to do. Lead is not so much of a issue, although it can get a bit finicky at very long ranges. But constantly having to manually guess and dial the range is actually not historically accurate in the slightest. Cross Gilmore. World War II fleets. Just Italy versus France. Who wins? Assuming France stays in the war, because pretty much the France went out as Italy came in. I think Italy was slightly ahead of the curve in terms of their modern ship construction. I think they'd get the Littorios in service before the French get the Richelieus, because Littorio and Vittorio Veneto were in service pretty quickly after Italy entered the war. Richelieu was not quite complete, and Jean Bart was very much not complete. So if it's an early war scenario, then the Italians will probably win on the grounds that the Littorios are significantly superior to Dunkirk and Strasbourg. As the war grinds on, though, if the French get Richelieu and Jean Bart in service, assuming obviously that somehow France doesn't fall, the Italians will eventually get Roma in service, but the French actually have a significantly larger build program that they keep going. So France, the longer the war goes on, assuming France is still in the war, the more of the advantage the French have. But the Italians probably have the advantage in the early part. Lost Muffin Man. What would have been the overall effect if the Bureau of Ordnance had not been incompetent and torpedoes had worked at the beginning of World War II? The Japanese Navy would have been short a lot of ships very early. I mean, they ended up being short by quite a lot of ships anyway, but they would have been short a lot of ships much, much earlier. The number of torpedoes that were fired and the number of potential hits that were scored in the first 6 months or so are just ridiculous. So, yeah. I mean, even if they'd fixed the torpedo problems in at least a vaguely reasonable time, it still would have helped a lot, but I mean, you look at something like, say, the Guadalcanal campaign, which obviously we've been covering and will continue to cover. There are a few ships on the Japanese orders of battles in various fights that physically wouldn't be there if the Mark 14 torpedo had worked properly. Comrade Thomas asks, has the ghost of Beatty come to haunt you? Not that I've noticed. John Hart. Britain maintains her 1902 alliance with Japan and relations with the US deteriorate. War occurs in 1930 between the US and Japan and Britain after a US attack on Canada. How does a naval war pan out? A naval war in 1930... I mean, a naval war in 1930 favours the Anglo-Japanese alliance by a considerable margin, because at that point, I mean, the US has built some of its early heavy cruisers, but you've got things like the Pensacola's. It's got the Omahas and it's got the Wicks-Clemson Swarm, but that's really about it. And they haven't really done all that much in the terms of modernisation and update to their battle line. The Royal Navy has considerably more cruisers than they do. Their battle line is slightly more updated at that point, although the Nelsons are still having significant turret problems. Sorry, Mrs. Drack was just passing through. But, I mean, the Washington Treaty at that point has created an approximate parity between the Royal Navy and US Navy, various minor issues one way or the other aside. The main problem is that if you're lumping the Japanese in as well, that means that you've effectively got 8-5, and the Americans are forced to split their forces because, the Americans have to split their forces, and because they're having to split their forces, that means that, technically speaking, the Royal Navy can do a kind of a holding action in the Atlantic if they want, and spare forces to beef up the Japanese, or they can just go all in if they can try and force the Americans into a fight in the Atlantic. How the naval war pans out depends largely on how the Americans want to play it. If they try and fight everyone everywhere, they'll probably lose. If they're a bit more sensible and they kind of turtle up on one side or the other, probably turtle up on the East Coast and try and hammer Japan as hard as possible, and then come back and deal with Britain once they've rebuilt from their losses. Then they've got a slightly better chance. But the thing is, it's by the time you're talking about the interwar period, any kind of naval war that involves America can, in some circumstances of combinations of allies like the British and the Japanese together, they can lose a naval war temporarily, but no one can invade the continental United States, which means that in the end it's a case of they might win or they might lose the first naval war, but if they lose the first naval war, they're going to go back and build up and fight the second naval war, and they'll probably just keep fighting until eventually they win, one way or the other. Copying questions. There are a lot of these questions. Right. Roger That Trucker asks, have you ever thought about asking Magellan TV about creating content for them? Never heard of Magellan TV, to be honest. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Silverfox575 asks, for admiral names, French Admiral Francois Joseph Paul, the admiral that brought the French fleet to Yorktown. He had a big impact. Yes, he did. And of course, Admiral, now that you've mentioned it, Admiral de Grasse as well. He had a fairly big impact on things. I really should have just stopped to think, who did the French name their cruisers after? Lord Oceanus. Which interwar World War II era battleship had the best designed torpedo protection, and by what margin did that ship outstrip the others? There's going to be a contentious question. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. Because you'd have to be looking at the treaty battleships. Because they would obviously have better torpedo protection than the 1920s battleships. But when you think about the treaty and post-treaty battleships, I can think of good points for every one of the ship's torpedo defense systems. So you've got Richelieu, Bismarck, Littorio, and technically Dunkirk and Strasbourg, but then obviously not going to win when you've got full-on battleships. You've got Yamato, you've got North Carolina, South Dakota, Iowa, King George V, Vanguard. But the thing is, I can think of strengths for every one of their torpedo defense systems, but I can also think of fairly big weaknesses for most, if not all, of their torpedo defense systems. I mean, even the North Carolina, South Dakota, Iowa line, they had good torpedo defense systems, but they also had some rather critical Achilles heels in them, which the US was planning to partially address with the second two Iowas and was planning to fully address with the third pair of Iowas, but obviously didn't get the chance. To be honest, yeah, it's a very hard call, that one. I maybe at some point I'm going to have to do a torpedo protection assessment video, kind of like I did for the anti-aircraft guns video, and compare them there. Because yeah, I don't think, in all honesty, I could point to a best designed torpedo protection, because then the little voice in my head would immediately be going, ah, yes, but what about this major weakness in it? But hey, you've just given me an inspiration idea for another Wednesday video, so good for you. Nosdormu89, at what point did other treaty powers realise that Japan and Germany didn't follow the treaties? By the early 1930s, especially for the Germans. Based on published statistics and looking at the various sizes, you could roughly retro-engineer ships, and it was very apparent relatively quickly in the early 30s, that some ships were definitely displacing an awful lot more than they officially were claimed to. But there wasn't an enforcement, a method of enforcement within those treaties other than you can leave the treaty. So yeah. Matches burn. I hope I didn't miss your earlier super chat, but I'm working my way through them now, so hopefully I haven't missed that. But I will copy this one in just in case. Himmelganger, do you have any knowledge about the Pacific War trilogy by Ian W. Toll? Since it's on Audible, one can be had for about $35 for 90 hours. The Pacific War trilogy is a very good set. Yeah, I mean, I'd recommend buying the books if you don't like audiobooks, and if you do like audiobooks, I'd recommend getting the audiobooks. Versus Arch, I believe Germany never signed the Washington or London Treaty. No, they didn't, but they were bound by the Versailles Treaty, which was more restrictive. And then when that was relaxed under the Anglo-German Naval Treaty, the Anglo-German Treaty, as well as giving them 35% of the displacement of the Royal Navy, did theoretically hold them. It was supposed to hold them to also the treaty limitations that the British were beholden to. So they never formally signed the actual Washington or London treaties, but by the letter of the Anglo-German Naval Treaty, they were supposed to also be obeying the treaty restrictions that at that point of the First London Naval Treaty. Lost Muffin Man, Pearl Harbor has 24-hour warning. Japanese are on their way. What effect would this have on the effectiveness of Japanese attack? It would be less, because all the anti-aircraft guns would be up and running, waiting for them. They'd probably have put some kind of improvised anti-torpedo defences out, and all the fighters from the airfields would probably be active and up and around. Christian Slot Hulk asks, Denmark 30, I take you 1935? You're tasked with building a North Atlantic fleet to deter any invasion. Maximum 150,000 tons. No ship over 15,000 tons to be ready for 1940. No ship over 15,000 tons. Okay, so max 150,000 tons. Who's likely to be coming at me as Denmark? The Germans. So I would probably build half a dozen 15,000-ton cruisers with an emphasis on protection, armor protection. Probably try and get some slightly heavier than 8-inch guns, or if people aren't going to sell me them, then like 12 8-inch guns on a 15,000-ton hull and a lot of armor, i.e. something that can go toe-to-toe with a Hipper and reliably win. And then the rest of the money would go into probably 1,800, 2,000-ton destroyers. So substantial-ish destroyers, but stuff that I can build in large numbers. Throw a few submarines in there as well. But yeah, basically a power... Okay. That's new. Anyway. Don't know what's going on with this. Right, so, yeah. Thrown a few subs, but yes, basically a bunch of fairly powerful cruisers and a whole load of destroyers to escort them. I mean, I've got a land border with Germany, so it's probably not going to help that much, but at least it'll deter seaborne invasion. Yeah, please avoid the modern politics in the chat. I get enough of that from the BBC. And I only even really look at the BBC to see what tier restriction I'm in these days. Spartani 548 asks, what changes about Rheinberg if the third shot from Prince of Wales strikes forward on the bridge and kills Lütjens, but Lindemann survives? At that point, if Lindemann's left around, the Admiral's gone, what are they going to do? I mean, Lindemann was slightly more aggressive than Lütjens, but a shell that knocks out enough of the bridge to kill Lütjens is probably, as well as the other damage to Bismarck, they're probably still going to have to run for home. But they might make it, because Lindemann's probably not going to make that ridiculously long radio transmission that tells everyone where they're going. Nagato 2044. The naval mine is good. The naval mine is sitting on the Drydock live talking area in the conservatory. It's just incredibly cold out there at the moment, so I'm doing it from inside. Cameron Jones says gerbil on shelf. I don't think so. The gerbils are a little bit noisier than that. Why is everyone saying gerbil on shelf? Hang on a second. I have dispatched a search party for the gerbil. Mock Harris, is the offshore bombardment in Normandy in the Normandy campaign underrated? It took Nelson and Rodney's fire support to break through 12th SS Division in the British sector. Most of its losses were from naval gunfire. It is a somewhat underappreciated aspect of the Normandy campaign in some circles. Yeah, so the Normandy campaign bombardments, they were very useful. I think the problem is that they sometimes get over-egged. And so that, as with most things, that leads to kind of a counter backlash, where people then go a little bit too far the other way and say that they were useless. You see this quite a lot with discussions about history. I mean, it's from all sorts of things. I mean, even as far as like as you know, one of my other interests is medieval history. When you get into medieval history across the world, you get the whole katana argument, where years ago there was this whole thing, oh, katana folded 1 million times can cut through anything, and then people pointed out, actually, no, that's complete rubbish. But then it kind of swung back a little bit too far the other way in some circles, where the katana was then being described as basically a sharpened iron stick that was completely useless and inferior to everything, and just massively overhyped. And the truth is somewhere in between. And it's the same thing with the Normandy bombardment. I think at the moment we're maybe looking at a little bit more of an upswing back towards recognising the contribution that it made. But it has been down in the dumps a little bit in the previous parts. Show us the gerbils. At some point when they want to come out. I think they're sleeping at the moment. Nosdormu 89, were there any purpose-built Q ships? From From the keel up, I don't think so. There were a few that were converted whilst under construction. There may have been a few dedicated ones, but to be perfectly honest, Q ships are not. I know what Q ships did. This is with my knowledge with Q ships is more about their capabilities, what they were armed with, what their mission profile was, and what they actually did. I must admit, I haven't studied all that much about where they came from. I probably should. Jeffrey Cook, agree or disagree? Admiral Hipper should have finished off Berwick since only Bonaventure, a Dido class, was around to defend. Potentially agree, but the Hippers are vulnerable to even Dido class armament if Bonaventure gets its guns on. Paul Berwick is the punching bag of the county class. I mean, yeah, objectively yes, but practically speaking, it would have opened Hipper up to a few too many possible negative scenarios, like Bonaventure getting in and starting rapid fire, or indeed Berwick actually, hitting something for a change. Bob and Raptor Joe, what effect, if any, what effect would having the 2 Alaska class at Jutland? Are the 12-inch guns a match for Battleship? Yeah, the 12-inch guns on the Alaska class are incredibly powerful for their size. 12-inch guns are viable combatant guns at Jutland anyway, and these 12-inch guns definitely are up a tier on those. Although, with that said, the main advantage of the Alaska class, because they don't have the world's best armor protection, is going to be their radar. Because with their radar, they can see through the murk, which will allow them to engage whichever side they're on, engage the enemies at longer ranges and see where they're coming. And assuming that those officers actually signal, whether it's Jellicoe or Shear, depending on whose side they're on, you're basically handing that fleet a massive intelligence coup. So if they're on the German, even if somehow they don't make any difference during the daytime battle, if you look at the nighttime battle, the nighttime engagements, if the Alaska class are on Shear's side, he'll know exactly where their Grand Fleet are, so he can just avoid them if he wants to. And if the Alaska class are on Jellicoe's side, they'll spot the High Seas fleet and tell him where they're going and where they're coming from, so Jellicoe will know where to be in the morning. So yeah, it's the radar of the Alaska class is the thing that's going to make the single biggest difference, although the guns will also still make a lot of difference. Christopher Kelly, which 5 ships from the post-Dreadnought era would you have preserved that are not already museums? I don't know, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I guess Hermes and Enterprise CVN 65 definitely. So I'm not that attached to most of the missile firing ships. I mean, I'd kind of like to preserve Kirov class as well. But yeah, other than that, there's like a whole load of small missile destroyers and frigates don't really hold that much appeal to me as museum ships per se. Yeah, apart from Enterprise, Hermes, and a Kirov, post-war, I'm drawing a little bit of a blank. The question is post Dreadnought era. Sorry, I thought for some reason my brain said post World War II. Okay, post Dreadnought era. That's. Oh no, that is the same. That is the same period. I suppose technically you could say post Dreadnought is maybe the 1930s onwards. In which case, obviously, add Vanguard to that list. And What else would we add? So let's see. So we're keeping Hermes, Akirov, Enterprise CVN 65, Vanguard. Yeah, and let's keep CV6 as well. Then you can have two Enterprises side by side. That would be a really nice museum to have. Ahmed Razik, what changes would you make to World of Warships? Basically similar to what I was saying before with the armor profiles. I would shorten up. I understand why they've shortened up the engagement ranges, but I would shorten up the armor penetration tables commensurately so they are proportional to the shortened engagement ranges, because then that would mean that ships with less firepower but more armor would actually be useful again, and ships with high firepower and little armor would still have a place, but it would be a much more tactical game. Yuzrel asking if I would add a Warspite. Well, Warspite is a Dreadnought era, so it's post-Dreadnought. I'm taking post-Dreadnought to mean when they stopped calling things Dreadnoughts, so that would be the 20s. That's the problem with post-Dreadnought. It could mean all sorts of things. You could mean after Battleships, you could mean after the term Dreadnought fell out of use, you could mean just after 1905. Gottjäger asks, 1949... DACR 1949 on Vanguard at Falklands. The best DACR proposal would use 6 34mm revolver cannons totaling 4,000 RPM, slightly less than Goalkeeper. Yeah, I mean, that as I've said before, the big thing about having Vanguard theoretically at the Falklands would have been its large would either be having what it had or a slight refitted version with large numbers of gun-based anti-aircraft weapons. That would be a massive boon to just keeping the problem is basically what it would do, it would force the Argentine aircraft to stay below the missile envelope and get shredded by guns, or fly above the gun envelope and get blown out of the sky by missiles. So yeah. Galdia Ionai, a butterfly flaps its wings, a single seemingly inconsequential detail changes. Where in naval history would that make the most spectacular difference? A single inconsequential detail changes, and where in naval history? You'll probably be looking at a battle that turned on one particular major event happening. I mean, it's very easy to point to Hood exploding at the Denmark Strait, which I have covered in a couple of videos earlier. This, well, last year now. Where else? Single inconsequential change, a battle that could have turned on a single point. You see, the thing is, it's tempting to say like the sniper that shoots Nelson misses, but that's not really going to change all that much unless you send Nelson up to fight the War of 1812, which would be somewhat amusing. Actually, that's a point Joel Thompson points out. Officer Seymour, yeah, very slight. Yeah, maybe he just doesn't meet Beatty. So BT actually ends up taking someone who knows how to signal. Oh, and that's another... Yeah, you guys are a bit faster on the draw than me. Serafin Gondor Ostas points out, yes, if Admiral Yamamoto had lost one more finger at the Battle of Tsushima, and he's now no longer in service, that would be a very inconsequential thing to happen, but, yeah, significantly huge impacts. XCOM Man, which cancelled ship or refit would you like to see completed? And what would be the most likely fate of that ship? Well, given the 2 Hood videos, I think you know that one. But cancelled ship I'd like to see completed, a G3 battle cruiser, because that would be hilarious. Watching that thing charge around in World War II. The most likely fate of it, well, it would probably end up sold for scrap, but it would probably actually survive the Second World War unless someone sent it down to... Unless it was sent in place of Repulse in Force Z, obviously. Comrade Thomas asks, do you think Admiral Fletcher's decision to pull out prior to Savo Island was justified, looking at this without the benefit of hindsight specifically? Overall, yes, he had to preserve the US's striking power, and to be perfectly honest, there was nothing that Admiral Fletcher being there would have done to change the outcome of the First Battle of Savo Island, because it happened at night. So, yeah, I mean, as I went over in the First Battle of Savo Island video, Admiral Fletcher had his reasons to pull the carriers back. Without hindsight, it's especially justified, because he needs to keep his carriers active. He needs to keep them fueled. The last thing you want is to have the US's main only heavy carrier strike force caught on the hop with low fuel. Cody85, a qualification on my question from the last stream. I was referring to armament versions of the Clemsons, the single fours, double fours, or single fives. The single fives were too heavy, if I recall correctly, for the Clemsons. I like the double fours, but they also kind of, they had their own issues, but I do like them. The single fives on the Clemsons, though, were important, because although they were a little bit too much for the Clemsons, they did prove the concept, and they paved the way for the Clemsons. The Clemsons with the single fives paved the way for the 5-inch armament on future US destroyers. Simon Trent 8000, I haven't seen your one. Wait, did I miss it? No, Simon Trent, your one is still here. It's still on the list. I'm working my way through them. I've actually run out of Iron Brew, so this is going to be an interesting one. Dylan Keeling, thoughts on a USA airship carrier? Any way to improve? Airship? You mean like Macon and Akron? No, just don't. Don't. It's a bad idea. It's a very, very bad idea. Basically, flying aircraft carriers are a cool concept, but that's all they are. They do not work, and never have. And until you've got some kind of nuclear-powered flying behemoth, they very likely never will. Maybe drones might solve some of that, but yeah, no, it's just don't. I remember that, Night Heron. Why have I not reached that? Yeah, so Night Heron Productions. The Imperial Hobby Productions 1-700 CVA-01 model project has reached its halfway point. So, yeah, if you fancy a model of CVA-01, go and check out them. That's Imperial Hobby Productions. I believe I looked at them when they were starting the project, and I think at the time they couldn't ship to the EU. Well, or the UK now, since it is the 1st of January 2021. Maybe they've changed. If they've changed the ability to ship to the UK, i.e. if they can now ship to the UK, then I'm definitely in on it. So yes, if you want a model of CVA-01, the Great British carriers that were never built, then do so. Layman Phelps, just wanted to say Happy New Year. May I ask what's your favourite ship of all time and why? I think most people who have watched these streams or videos before will know, but my answer is Warspite, because Warspite. There's a rare combination of a lucky ship and a long-lived ship that ends up with a battle honours listing that is just insanely impressive. William Scott Shelton was playing World of Warships. Noticed British 6-inch cruisers don't have HE shells. Is that correct for World War II? No. No, it is not. They did have HE shells. But game balance. I'm going to put that on mute again. Sorry, I just realised my phone has been pinging. Cow to Face. Why does so many pre-World War I capital ships have torpedoes? Is it a result of the range for battleship fighting at the time? Yeah, pretty much.
At first, it's a range issue. The torpedoes and battleship gun engagements have pretty much the same range up until the 1900s. And then as the 1900s go on and gun ranges increase, there's still a thought that you're going to have to close in to finish off ships. And if you're going to close in to finish off ships, you might as well use torpedoes that open holes in the bottom rather than shells that punch holes in the top. So yes, that's why battleships still have torpedoes at that point, because they're thinking of using them as the final blow weapons. Box Ghost 102. How large was your channel when you started getting collaboration officers and other invites like Armchair Admirals? I have no idea, but the first collaboration offers I got were actually very early in the channel's history as far as like overall subscriber numbers, etc. were. And that was from Napalm Ratter and Military History Visualized, I think, were the first two that offered to do collaborations with me. And I've done other collaborations as well. I've done collaboration, obviously, since then with Great War Channel, with Military Aviation History, with Justin, with obviously with the Armchair Admiral series with World Warships. So yeah, but I think Military History Visualized and Napalm Ratter were the first two that I actually did collaboration videos with, and they were a while ago. So the channel can't have been too big at that time. Cody 85, what do you think of the TBY Seawolf? And what effect on the Pacific War would it have had if they'd adopted that instead of the TBF? Let me have a quick look. Consolidated TBY Seawolf. Okay, so it's basically slightly better than the Avenger, but badly delayed. So, well, if it's better than the Avenger and they manage to get it into service without those delays, it's going to be somewhat more effective. I mean, this is the thing. Swapping out US aircraft in the Pacific War for slightly better aircraft just means the US wins slightly harder. It's not going to have a massive impact on the overall event, because in the end, I think most of us can agree the US won the Pacific War pretty convincingly. Crowbar 79, will there be another Armchair Admirals? Yes, I think at the end of January. I think we just took Christmas off. Mermaid Devil, throughout World War II, which ship do you know of that was in dry dock for repairs, refit, etc. the most? As a proportion of its overall wartime service, probably Belfast. It was pretty much out of action from within the first few weeks of the war until 1943. So that's 40, 41, 42, bits of 43. It's about 3.5 years out of 5. Some of the German ships like Gneisenau were in and out of dry dock an awful lot as well, but yeah, that one long overhaul for Belfast probably is one of if not the longest. Box Ghost 102 say World War I ended in a draw on the Washington Naval Treaty occurs. Would Germany have been capable of closing the gap with Britain in that scenario? No. They'd given up on trying, actually, by the time World War I started, and they never were aiming to surpass the Royal Navy. They were following Tirpitz's risk fleet strategy of building a navy big enough that the Royal Navy would leave them alone. They knew they couldn't build to a point to exceed the Royal Navy, and even their risk fleet strategy they kind of abandoned by 1914. So, no, if World War I ends in a draw, the High Seas Fleet at 1918 is massively outnumbered by the Royal Navy, and in the 3 years between that and the Washington Treaty, there's time for maybe one generation of capital ships to be built, and the Royal Navy has more on the stocks than the Germans do. Todd Webb, just
retype your super chat. It's not in my list. But I don't know if I've mentioned it because there are a few that I copied in that I didn't get the names of. And similarly, Matches Burn. I seem to have missed your one on Torpedo CIWS, so if you can retype it, I'll keep an eye for it. Colin S. asked, if the US Navy had decided on twin turrets for the Alaskas instead of triples, how big could these guns have plausibly been? On the Alaskas, 14-inch. It's the general rule of thumb of if you're going to... if you can drop a gun to increase the caliber by 2 inches, broadly speaking. So yeah, twin 14s instead of triple 12s would be the plausible way of doing it. Bismarck, would there be any advantages brought from nuclear auxiliary vessels, oilers replenishment, etc.? Also, is the Forrestal video still planned? Yeah, Forrestal is right up on the edge of when I'd cover, but Forrestal will eventually be covered. MD Ofsted, do you remember Warships 1 website back in the day? Yes, I do. Nuclear auxiliary vessels for replenishment. I suppose this is from the pint-sized nuclear vessels question, nuclear reactors question. Theoretically, yes, but if you've got a limited supply of them, the strategic implications of using them on anything other than a capital ship really aren't acceptable at the time. Simon Trent 8000. Enjoyed your series on Pearl Harbor battleship repairs. Thank you. Odd request. The diesel auxiliary engines used on Bismarck? Yeah, when I get around to doing the more unusual ship propulsion systems, I will be covering diesel auxiliary engines both in First and Second World War German capital ships. By the original domain of Warships 1. I've probably got better things to do, to be honest. Well, it depends, would that get the actual content as well, but there you go. Paul from Chicago, how much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck was boatswain of HMS Woodchuck? 3 woodchuck body masses? I don't know, how much wood can a woodchuck chuck? I'm sure someone's worked that out. Fafix 666. Hara mentions proximity fuse shells on Yahagi during Tengen Ichigo. Is this accurate? What naval proximity shells did Japan have? P.S. When can I expect my 18 times I-400 in the Atlantic question answered? Your I-400 question I'm going to stick in to the Drydock that's released next weekend, not this coming Sunday, not the one in a couple of days, because that's an absolute monster Patreon Drydock, but the one after that. You might want to drop me a message, maybe like Tuesday, Wednesday, just to remind me to include it, but it is on my list to include in that one. But as far as proximity shells on Yahagi, I don't know. They definitely didn't have proximity shells. What they might have had that made them think they had proximity shells were timed detonation shells. That they definitely did have access to. And if somebody was doing pretty quick, doing a pretty good job on setting the timer on the shells, then they would have been detonating in close proximity, which would have then allowed them to it would have made the pilots think that they were proximity shells because they were going off so close and so nearby. Jeffrey Cook, why was Lutzow's gunnery during the Battle of the Barents Sea so bad compared to Admiral Hipper? That's ironic considering the subject of tomorrow's 5-minute guide, but basically Lutzow seems to be a floating reminder of why you don't change the name of a ship. There is obviously the old sailor superstition, you don't change the name of a ship because it's bad luck. Lutzow's probably the case study for that. It's called Deutschland, does okay. Okay, got bombed once in the Spanish Civil War, but never mind. Gets its name changed to Lutzow, goes on one operation, gets shot up, then gets torpedoed while it's on its way back for repairs from being shot up, tries to go out again, gets torpedoed again before it can do anything particularly consequential, goes back into harbour, gets repaired again, goes up to Norway, finds that there's no fuel, then builds up enough fuel, tries to go out to attack a convoy, runs aground, has to be repaired again. And then, once that's been repaired, goes back up, suffers engineering problems. That means it has to go back and get repaired again. So, yeah, basically the ship spent a good chunk of the war in repairs. And so I suspect a lot of its poor gunnery was down to the fact the crew had probably not seen all that much operational experience at that point. So, yeah. Do not be on Lutzow. It's a bad idea. Miles McCaskill, given the reduced combat effectiveness of both Hood and her antiquated fire control and Prince of Wales with her malfunctioning guns, what in theory odds would you give each side? What in theory odds would you give each side at Denmark Strait? Well, yeah. Right, I'm going to come back to those because I just realised the oven is beeping, so I need to go and turn it off because I didn't think I was actually going to be here for so long. So, let me just put the keyboard down, and I will be back in a couple of minutes once I've turned the oven off. There we go. Right. Dinner is saved. Let's bring the microphone back in without bashing things. Right. Begun Discord. Yeah, I mean, if the original Warship 1 archive setup is still there, I might be tempted to try and revive the whole thing. Someone will have to send me a few more details on that. Todd Webb, I see you now. Right. If a fully operational Jean Bart had beaten Massachusetts, could a battle line of New York, Texas, and Arkansas have taken a fully operational Jean Bart? Yes, probably. Yes, because, well, I mean, two things. One, 3 versus 1 means 2 ships are unengaged, so they've got pretty much open field of fire. Secondly, if Jean Bart fought and beat Massachusetts, there's a very small chance that it would be able to do that without Massachusetts scoring some hits back, so Jean Bart would already be at a disadvantage in that case. So, yes, a somewhat damaged Jean Bart, even though it could probably take out any one of those ships in relatively short order. In the time it's doing that, the other two have free fire on Jean Bart, which means that especially if Jean Bar's still tied up to dock, it will be taken out one way or the other. MD Hofstee, if you could send me some details via Discord or via email about the Warships 1 site, that might be an interesting thing to try and bring back if enough of the data is still there. Miles McCaskill's question anyway, what in theory odds would you give each side at Denmark Strait, knowing with the various issues that Hood and Prince of Wales had in the tactics that they ended up having to use at Denmark Strait? They still had a reasonable chance. I mean, Prince of Wales got some hits in on Bismarck. If Hood had not blown up when she did, given that Prince of Wales was already scoring hits, it's possible that in the following 5 to 10 minutes, Prince of Wales might have started to score meaningful hits, and also Norfolk and Suffolk were almost caught up, so they could have pulled off Prince Eugen. Again, even with their various degradements, theoretically the British side still has an advantage, albeit a slight one, at Denmark Strait. I'd say maybe 55-45. It would largely depend on, once it's turned again, can Hood start scoring hits, and can Prince of Wales continue to score hits if it's not having to radically manoeuvre away and then be the only thing that's under fire. Right. Right, so there was that. That was Miles McKesson. Mr. Final Resistance. Are there any German World War I vessels which could be refitted like the Queen Elizabeths, and what would their impact on World War II be? Not that survived. I mean, theoretically, if they'd somehow kept the Bardens around, they could have modernised those, but they were left with just pre-dreadnoughts, which, yeah, they're not going to be modernised on those lines. I mean, in theory, they could have tried and brought back Goeben from Turkey. That could have been modernised. So, yeah, it's... Good night, Pepminator. Says good night, so yeah. MD Hofstee, yeah, it might only have US ships, but we can... There might be something worth saving. I mean, as you say, the US stuff is quite detailed, so it's always... This is the thing, with naval history, if someone's put together a good collection of it, even if only some of it survives, it's still worth saving. Because then, even if you have to rebuild the rest, it's reduced your workload. Meatwad asks, he says, I really enjoyed your anti-aircraft video. How much did radar fire control system and VT fuses contribute to AAA effectiveness? Greatly. There's a US analysis out there somewhere. I think I've got a PDF copy of it somewhere, where they compare the effectiveness of 5-inch rounds before and after the introduction of the VT fuses. Like, how many 5-inch rounds do we usually need to kill an aircraft before and after the introduction of the proximity fuse? And it's a huge reduction. The proximity fuse makes things so much easier for the anti-aircraft gunners to score kills with, which is probably just as well considering what they were facing with the kamikazes and such. Fafix 666. I think Hara might have meant anti-ship shells. Why would you have a proximity anti-shipping shell? I have no idea. I mean, again, the thing is that there are circumstances which can make anti-ship shells explode prematurely. Everything from poor shell quality manufacture to running into bits of shrapnel to tumbling, setting off the fuse, etc. I can't think why there'd be an anti-ship proximity shell. That makes no sense to me. Yes, Drydock 127 is a massive monster. That took a long time to record. Frank Sposazzo asks, can you give a well-educated guess as to how many rounds from each American battleship at Surigao Strait actually hit Yamashiro from each battleship? When I get down to doing the Battle of Surigao Strait, I will try and make that estimate. Off the top of my head, I'm probably going to guess. Well, I couldn't give you a guess off the top of my head for each battleship scoring hits, but I'm going to probably estimate somewhere between 12 and 24 rounds direct effective hits, given what happened to Yamashiro. But yeah, that's something I'd have to do as part of my research into the battle when I get round to doing that battle as a video. He also asks, how much better were the Iseis over the Fusos if they were at Surigao instead, and why were they chosen to be a half carrier instead of any other class? They were slightly faster than the Fusos. They had a different armour and main gun battery layout. So they were an incremental improvement over the Fusos. I'd say the Iseis are to the Fusos kind of like what the Iron Dukes are to the King George V's or the Orions. They're an incremental stage improvement. So they are qualitatively better, but they're not a massive game changer overall. If they were at Surigao, no, it's not going to change anything, apart from the name of the ship that gets sunk. And as to why they were chosen to be a half carrier, basically they weren't thought to be sort of combat capable, but they were in better condition than the Fusos, and they were slightly faster, so they suited the conversion a bit better. They weren't going to convert the remaining Congos or the Nagato, because although both of those were faster than the Iseis, they thought they could still use them in the battle line. Whereas if you look at the careers of the Iseis and Fusos during World War II, the Japanese really didn't do all that much with them. Mr. Final Resistance, if most of the High Seas Fleet survives World War I and doesn't get scuttled or scrapped by the British, in that case, definitely the two Bardens, or Bayerns, depending on what you want to call them, they could definitely benefit from a QE-style modernisation, and the Derflinger and Hindenburg as well. I wouldn't refit any of the 11-inch battle cruisers or the 12-inch battleships, to be honest. I'd do those four. Those would be the ones that I would modernise, because they're the ones that will actually mean something. 11 and 12-inch armed ships, even modernised, are very much second line or possibly even third line ships by World War II. Night Heron Productions. If Hood had a Repulse-style 32-36 rebuild around the same time with machinery updates, engines, boilers, turbines, etc., how do you see World War II going for her? She'd have a very different war, because she'd be able to keep her speed up, so that means she's not going to strip turbines chasing down Strasbourg. She might catch Strasbourg, you never know. That'd be an interesting one. And she's not going to be constantly being pulled in for quick refits and repairs to keep patching her machinery together. As a result, whether or not she's still with the home fleet at the time Bismarck sails is a completely open question, because if she's a lot more useful and not basically tied on a short leash to the dockyards, they might deploy her out to, say, they might keep Repulse and Renown back with the home fleet and deploy Hood in Renown's place in Force H. But it's difficult to tell. They might still keep her in the home fleet because of her perceived power. And if she is kept with the home fleet, well, updated machinery is not going to save her from Bismarck. But if she's down with Force H, she might end up actually getting called in to finish off Bismarck, because historically Renown was with Ark Royal and was told not to close in because they were worried about it getting blown up. Whereas if something else has been blown up at the Battle of the Denmark Strait and Bismarck's now being battered, Hood might then move in for a kill during its final battle. Frank Sposato, How did the sinking of the Titanic affect the Royal Navy, especially during the height of the Dreadnought race? It didn't really affect anything in the Dreadnought race of the Royal Navy. The main thing that came out of the sinking of the Titanic was better safety features on civilian ships, especially with regards to lifeboats. But that inquiry took a little while to make its recommendations. World War One was pretty much almost in effect by that point. But also, excuse me, when you're talking about warships, they're not too concerned with having enough lifeboats for everyone in the crew, because if they need them, the chances are the crew numbers have probably been reduced somewhat, and probably the lifeboat numbers have been reduced somewhat as well. Nosdomu 89, how many sets of binoculars thrown by Rossovensky would it take to sink the Kamchatka? Depends. I don't know. I'm going to say 42. Then Tim Statler asks, have you heard of a battleship shooting down a plane with its main guns? I know this would be more likely to be accidental or extremely lucky. As a few people I think were mentioning in the chat, the Japanese obviously had the Type 3 shells for their various battleships for use in anti-aircraft work. I'm not sure if any of them actually shot anything down with them. They did look pretty, though. There's some reports that indicate potentially one of the Scharnhorsts might have shot down one of the swordfish that was attacking them during the Channel Dash with an 11-inch shell, with an accidental kind of, we've removed the lower half of your aircraft, please don't look for it situation. So that would probably be the closest to a confirmed battleship main gun kill that I've read. The other thing is a lot of battleships, when they were under air attack, would fire their main guns into the sea to create columns of water that could potentially take out an aircraft if they flew into them. But again, I don't know off the top of my head if any planes were actually taken down that way. Miles McCaskill has continued from the last question. Why would the British choose to engage with only 55-45 odds? Why not continue to shadow and wait for more advantageous engagement? Well, the thing was, they didn't know that Prince of Wales's guns were going to break down quite that much. They were aware of some of Hood's combat limitations. Also, they weren't aware it was going to just explode. But also, they were not aiming for the engagement they were fighting at Denmark Strait. They wanted a very different engagement to happen. And they were forced into what turned out to be Denmark Strait by Suffolk losing contact with Bismarck at the last minute, and them guessing slightly wrong as to where the German position was going to be. But once they were established where Bismarck and Prince Eugen were, it still was a battle cruiser dash fast battleship and a new fast battleship against a new fast battleship and a heavy cruiser. So on paper, they had a significant advantage. As I say, they didn't know that Prince of Wales's guns were going to be quite so problematic. And even with that, Prince of Wales still got a reasonable number of hits in. So they would have gone in thinking that they had much better odds than they did. As for why not shadowing, basically because the longer they tried to shadow, they knew that neither, because of its engine problems, Hood, and because of its top speed, Prince of Wales, couldn't keep up with Bismarck and Prince Eugen if they put the pedal to the metal. And if they shadowed them for too long, the two German ships would break out into the Atlantic, at which point it would be very difficult to track them down if the Germans decided to just go full throttle and go, bye, we're off, see you later. Mason Stewart, what if Scharnhorst didn't separate from its destroyers during the North Cape action? That's an interesting one, because the weather was so awful. Pretty much a lot of the fighting was done via radar, which would have seen the destroyers anyway. Now, when you've got Norfolk, Belfast and Sheffield initially, I think it might have allowed Scharnhorst to get away, because then if Bay ordered his destroyers to kind of cover the rearguard action with torpedoes and gunfire, even though the 3 British cruisers probably would have made relatively short work of them, and good luck getting an accurate torpedo shot in that weather, at anything other than absolute point-blank range, it would have probably delayed the pursuit long enough for Scharnhorst to slip away into the murk beyond radar range, so therefore Scharnhorst would have had a much better chance of evading and making its way home. It might still have run into Duke of York and Jamaica anyway, by sheer happenstance, but Scharnhorst probably would have had a lot better chance of getting away, even though it would have led to the loss of a number of cruisers. A number of destroyers on the Kriegsmarine's part. Did anyone see Matches Burns' question about torpedo CRWS? If they did, please repost it. Archangel Glenn, and then we're caught up with those, says, assuming crews were equal, who would win in a fight? King George V, Tennessee, or Nagato? Also, I think there was confirmation Yamato shot down the plane. It's possible. I mean, there's reports from some of the Japanese side that Yamato's explosion took out a bunch of aircraft, although I know from an email I've received that is apparently under dispute. As for assuming equal crews who would win in a fight between King George V, Tennessee, or Nagato, well, Tennessee, unfortunately, is a World War I era standard class, so that is not really going to face off against a treaty era battleship. Then you've got Nagato King versus King George V. I'd probably give the advantage to King George V, because Nagato's armour really is not much to write home about, and King George V, for pretty much its entire operational career, has radar. Nagato doesn't. By the time you get to a point where Nagato might even be considered for fitting with the basic radar that the Japanese were able to equip it with, King George V at that point will have full radar fire control. So because of the sensor advantage and the fact that Nagato's armour really isn't going to help it at all, again, even though King George V is mounting 14-inch guns, I'd say King George V has the advantage there. But then again, that's not really too much of a surprise, considering King George V is a 1930s treaty-era battleship, Nagato is a Washington era battleship, and Tennessee is a World War I era standard. Right. Okay, so this is basically now, how long do I have before my voice dies? Considering it's 25 past 10. And Drydock discussions. Okay, right, I'll check that. Thank you, MD Hofstee. Let's start grabbing questions until voice gives, or let's face it, probably about another 15-20 minutes, and then you're probably all sick of me anyway. Captain Seafort, you've been previously been fairly complimentary about some of the later pre-dreads and rather less so about some of the first generation dreadnoughts. Do you think any pre-dreadnought could beat an early dreadnought one-on-one? Depending on the range, yes. The Danton class, as I've said several times previously, were designed for that kind of close range knife fight, and I think probably could have taken on some of the not so good first generation dreadnoughts as long as the range was fairly close. I mean, a lot of the very last gen pre-dreads, like the Lord Nelsons, the Satsumas, they were all verging on, some of them are called semi-dreadnoughts. So yeah, the very last generation pre-dreads generally could, in theory, beat some of the not so good first gen dreadnoughts, as long as they were allowed to fight close enough to get their heavy secondary batteries into play. But given that most of the first gen dreadnoughts are faster than the pre-dreads, it would be the dreadnoughts fight to lose in most cases. GeoGuy 001, would the guns on the proposed Japanese A150 class battleship have been too difficult to aim effectively? I don't think so. They would have been pushing it, but I think the larger problem would have been just low numbers of shells and the sheer logistics of loading it. Aiming it would have been okay, but there's a lot of other disadvantages to that kind of thing. Mason Stewart says he was thinking it would increase Admiral Bay's confidence by having his destroyers, so he would have stayed and finished off Norfolk and driven off the other cruisers. I don't have a particularly great opinion of Admiral Bay. He's around at Narvik as well, and he doesn't exactly cover himself in glory there. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest, how he ended up being an admiral. He's not anywhere close to the finest example of the Kriegsmarine's command staff. If he had his... Scharnhorst still has orders to break off, and bearing in mind as well that because of the confusion in the snow, Bay initially thinks that Norfolk is a 15-inch battleship, a Revenge class or QE, and that Sheffield and Belfast are heavy cruisers. So if he's faced with what he thinks is 2 heavy cruisers and a battleship with 15-inch guns, and he's got Scharnhorst with 11-inch guns and some destroyers, he's still going to be falling back from that. The Germans generally, remember, they don't want to fight enemy warships in these missions. They want to kill convoys. And both Scharnhorsts turned away when they were under a slightly more dynamic set of leadership from Malaya. When you're thinking about, I'm fighting in a snowstorm with possibly Malaya again, or a near relative, plus 2 cruisers, and I've only got 1 battleship and a few destroyers, someone like Admiral Bay is still going to fall back. There are some German admirals who might not. I'll give you that much. But yeah, Bay, no, not so much. IO2. If Britain decided to treat the Washington Naval Treaty as more of a polite suggestion like Japan did post-1930, also, which would you preserve as a museum ship? One of the KGVs or Vanguard? Vanguard. Vanguard, definitely. It looks a lot nicer. And also, it's the last battleship, so that kind of has that ring to it. If the British decided to treat the Washington Naval Treaty as more of a polite suggestion post-1930, you'd probably see a lot of the town class would probably end up roughly how they ended up anyway, maybe with a slightly better armour layout, because with the light cruisers the British were trying to get as many as possible. They wanted powerful ones. They were trying to, at the same time, they were trying to stay within the Washington limits. So you might see them just go, you know what, stuff it. If the Japanese bring out the Megamis, the Americans bring out the Brooklyns, we're going to bring out our own 5-turreted ship as well. Excuse me, my voice is beginning to go. Yeah, a lot of their stuff, a lot of their cruiser designs were under 10,000 tons anyway, apart from the towns. But if they're treating the treaty as more of a polite suggestion post-1930 and they're not driving for the 14-inch limit on the KGVs, you might see the KGVs basically either, they might either go with the 1515 idea that they had, or you might see the KGVs roll out as basically kind of prototype Lions with 1616s, because they might then try and disguise some of the displacement to get a similar kind of armour and speed, but with 1616s, and without doing a South Dakota style compaction exercise. And you probably end up with something at 38,000 tons or thereabouts. Kaiju Director, favourite paint camo scheme? Most of the late Victorian era peacetime colour schemes. Mikasa's black and white is good. Royal Navy black, white and buff is good. Great White Fleet is brilliant if you can find out a way to paint it properly. Yeah. Ben Grogan says the torpedo CIWS question was something along the lines of, you've mentioned a 30mm anti-torpedo CIWS before. Did this idea go anywhere? If not, why hasn't it been tried before? Right, okay, so the main problem with anti-torpedo CIWS is that torpedoes actually, contrary to the movies, do tend to run relatively deep. And if anyone's watched the Mythbusters episode where they try shooting into water, you'll know that high-speed projectiles tend to shatter and not go very far, but even the lower speed projectiles don't tend to go that far into the water and still remain effective. So the big problem with an anti-torpedo CIWS gun system is that getting the projectiles deep enough into the water to intercept the torpedo and still have anything like the energy to do damage to the torpedo. I mentioned in the anti-aircraft video that some of the Japanese guns had anti-submarine warfare rounds, but they were rounds that were designed to travel through the water to hit submarines either at or very near the surface, not to go after torpedoes. So to get a 30mm anti-torpedo CIWS working, the main thing is you're going to have to design some kind of shell that is optimized for travel through water, and you're going to have to do an awful lot of experiments to try and work out if you can get between the optimized shape and the speed and find a sweet spot where you can actually get the bullets to go, or shells to go deep enough. Otherwise, you're going to have to end up with kind of anti-torpedo torpedoes. Delta Raven, why did more navies not follow the French design of having all the main guns on the bow, making crossing the T pointless and armour more effective? Because it leaves an exposed aft area where you don't have any main battery firepower, was one of the main concerns. There are efficiency savings in terms of your armour layout, but the other thing is, if you're following the French style with quads, you're limiting yourself to 8 guns, and you might want more than that. You've also have the issue if you go with the quads of you have 2 turrets, so if you lose a turret, you lose half your firepower. As if you've got 3 triples, not only do you have an extra gun, but if you lose a turret, you've only lost 1/3 of your firepower. The French obviously tried to get around that by having their quads more like 2 twins in very close formation with an armoured bulkhead in between. So in theory, if you lost half the turret, you didn't lose the other half, although it might still jam the whole thing. And if you went with a more Nelson style, you just put your 3 triples up front, you've got something that looked like the Nelsons, which could be somewhat inconvenient depending on your engagement profile. So yeah, there's a lot of minor decisions back and forth on that. It's, if you think you can get a conventional layout with all the requisite speed and armor that you want, then you're probably going to go for that just because it's a little bit easier. But everyone was looking at the all-forward layout. So one of the early versions of the North Carolina, when it was armed with 14-inch weapons, went with an all-forward layout. If you look in Friedman's US Battleships, the all-forward layout was being studied quite extensively by pretty much all navies, including, say, the Americas, but also the Japanese, back in the interwar period. Budguy8829, do you have an opinion of the US 18-inch gun? Haven't seen any ballistics on it, but the US didn't see a big enough advantage to put them on a ship. Yeah, the 18-inch gun, you do start to run into some issues. But the Americans, somewhat uniquely, went with, even back in the 20s, went with a 50 caliber 16-inch gun. So they had the firepower in the 16-inch guns that was a bit more than what most other people had. And so they were a bit more happy to stick with that. And obviously you could get more of them. So there is always this argument of more guns versus slightly bigger guns. And I mean, even back in the First World War, even though the Americans were, the ship designers and the US Navy was pushing for 16-inch guns, you do see in the early stages when they're building their initial responses to things like the Queen Elizabeth, they're going with 4 triple 14s instead of 4 twin 15s, and so forth. So that the argument over slightly more but slightly weaker guns, or fewer, heavier guns is forever being fought during the battleship design era, and it largely comes down to, do our guns reliably penetrate the armor that we think we're going to go up against? If so, then there's no point upgrading them, just get more of them so you can get more hits. If you think the enemy has better armor, or you think they're going to deploy better armor, then I'd go for bigger guns, because you've got better armor penetration at that point. Joshua Calver asks, after the Russo-Japanese War of 1920, Poland wanted a pair of Ganguts as reparations. Assuming they got them and managed to move them to Britain in 1939, how useful would a pair of Ganguts be to the war effort? Depends if they get the upgraded ones. Or in 1920, you're not going to get them upgraded. If they've kept them in original flavour, they're probably going to be used pretty much like the Corbett's, whereas barrack ships, museum ships, not museum ships, barrack ships, holding ships, store ships, etc. Something that's an upgraded one might be a useful convoy escort or something, or shore bombardment vessel, something like that. But yeah, unupgraded Ganguts, unmodernized. Yeah, they're not going to be particularly useful. Dalpui, do you think Admiral Trowbridge could have stopped the Goeben, and was his treatment afterwards justified? I think he got it in the neck a little bit too harshly afterwards. As for whether he could have stopped Goeben, personally, I think he could, but I know there is a lot of argument and discussion about that. There pretty much from the minute he decided he wasn't going to try. At some point in this year, I do want to try and get that war gamed out so that we can answer it from a little bit more of an objective standpoint. Nagato 2044. What are the differences between Nagato and Mutsu in 1940? Mutsu's about to blow up. That's a big difference. The modernization of Nagato as well is, you see this with all the Japanese ships that get any kind of significant modernization, including the Congos, and actually with all the modernizations, the American modernizations of their ships, the British modernizations of theirs, they're constantly learning with every modernization what works better. And so there are no two ships that are modernized exactly alike, because they're constantly going, oh, well, that didn't quite work, or we've got this new tech that's working slightly better. So the longer the ships are in service, the more modernizations they get, the further everything splits apart. As for the precise differences between Nagato and Mutsu in 1940 specifically, I would have to look those up. Offhand, I think Nagato was slightly more modern than Mutsu at that point. De Wolfman asks, what were some of the other drawbacks of oxygen torpedoes, aside from the tendency of oxygen to propellant to explode when hit with a high-speed projectile, and the telltale "Here I am" bubble? So the oxygen torpedoes didn't have the bubble trail. Everyone else did. The oxygen torpedoes were renowned for being fairly stealthy. Drawbacks of the oxygen torpedoes, it was mainly around the explosive part, the fact that you had to have oxygen generators on board, which increased fire risks, and you had to be very careful to avoid the oxygen getting out and getting into contact with all sorts of things that might then catch fire. But by and large, there were a lot of advantages to the oxygen torpedo, as you'll find out later this month, I think, when there's a short Wednesday video that I've recently finished the script on the Type 93 Long Lance. So yeah, spoiler alert, you'll get a Type 93 video at some point this month. Although, as I say, it's a relatively short one. MD Hofstede says, I remember a picture I saw of a Yamato battleship being built, and it shows the slipway being completely covered up with a net. I think I've seen the one you mean. The Japanese did go to a ridiculous length to try and conceal Yamato's actual shape and size. Ben Grogan, in World War I, were there any U-boat boarding actions of warships, not merchants at sea? U-boat boarding actions of warships, no. I mean, not unless you count an armed merchant ship or something. No, but a warship at sea with a U-boat on the surface results in a sunk U-boat. And there were a few boarding actions by warships against U-boats, especially ones where the ship physically boarded the U-boat and then cut it in half. Scooter JSP, do you think a navalized version of the Mosquito would have had a major effect if it had been developed earlier and in greater numbers? Potentially, but you would have needed something like Ark Royal to survive, or other similar large British carriers. It was proved, obviously, that it could be done by one of the greatest test pilots of all time. But I don't think you really would have wanted to be trying to operate a twin-engine aircraft like a Mosquito off of an armoured carrier. I could see them operating maybe off of Ark Royal, or if there'd been like an Admiral class conversion, carrier conversion back in the 20s, so you got something like a British version of Lexington. But yeah, the armoured carriers I think were a little bit too small for any significant number of Sea Mosquitoes to be an effective solution. Right, okay, so I'll take a couple more questions, and then 2 or 3 more questions, and then I will probably wrap it up, because I am beginning to lose my voice and my food will get cold, and I really, really want a nice dinner. It'd be really, really sucky to start the first day of the year off with stone cold dinner. Scooter JSP, do you have a favourite non-war game tabletop board game? I have a few. Steampunk Rally, Muffin Time, non-war game ones. Oceans, that's quite good. Settlers of Catan. Yeah, I think those would be my top non-wargame tabletop board games at the minute. John Ashley Smith, do you remember the first book on sea warfare you read as a young lad? Yes. Yes, I do, actually. Specifically on sea warfare, as opposed to the Ladybird, sort of Ladybird histories of various bits and pieces, was the Imperial War Museum Book of the War at Sea, by Julian Thompson, who I had the great pleasure of meeting recently, at least, well, digitally at least. My very, very well-worn copy is over there on the shelf. That was an absolutely great book, and that was that I got that at age. That was my first proper book on sea warfare. I got that at age 11, I think. Before that, it had just been kind of generic, let's say, Ladybird histories and the more basic stuff. Nico de Furslocher. Yeah, as I said, if you want to know about the US Franklin video, go to the Discord, general chat, look at the pin post. Timothy Schmidt, if the US Navy had gone with a super heavy 14-inch round like the 2,700-pound 16-inch AP shell, how heavy would it have been? Depends on the gun. The different 14-inch guns had different weights of shell, but I don't think that would have been a brilliant idea, to be perfectly honest. I'd have to check on the weight of the 14-inch round, but to be honest, I personally, and I know this is a divisive opinion, and not everyone agrees with me by a long way, but I personally don't think the super heavy rounds were worth it. But that's my personal opinion. I would have much rather have seen a standard weight shell being fired from a 16-inch 50 gun, because then that shell would have gone hilariously fast, and and a hilariously long distance, and probably been poking holes in ships like nobody's business. Okay. Oh, yes, yeah, well, yes, BDF TN07. There is Dystopian Wars, but that is a tabletop war game, and I was asked for non-war game tabletop games. So, right, last question then. Carl von Gusenberg, Discord me that question, because I think that requires a fairly long answer. I do want to answer it, but just not right now. Where's my last one then? Mark Blackburn. Okay, Mark Blackburn asked a question about counterfactual questions. I don't mind counterfactuals as long as they're relatively well thought out, and as long as people are prepared to accept an answer that potentially the outcome is not really predictable and it could range over a vast distance. But I do think that's why one of the reasons I do this Drydock live segment once a month is so that the alternate history stuff, because I know some people do find counterfactuals and alternate histories a little bit annoying. I kind of put them all in one place here where we can talk about them, we understand them, people can ask and add qualifiers and revisions, etc. And then the Drydocks themselves can be based more about sort of factual question and answer. I personally, and again, I know this is a little bit of a divisive question amongst various naval historians I've talked to, but I personally think that counterfactuals do have a place. A certain place within the discussion of naval history. Looking at what could have been is always fun, at least for me. But I do like to keep a little bit of a separation between that and the serious history. I mean, if you're going to write a bunch of what ifs, there are books of historical what ifs. Perfectly valid thing to do. But always sort of put a little bit of a line between this is what actually happened and potentially this is what could have happened. It's all about, as with most things, it's all about the question and how well it's crafted and thought through. But I know there's a lot of people out there, a lot of historians I've talked to who hate counterfactuals, and I understand why. Yeah. So, with that said, I'm going to go off and eat some dinner and look up the Flannan Isles Lighthouse Mystery, whatever that is. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you for listening to me rattle on for nearly 4 hours. And hope to catch you again at some point in the future. Whether that is going to be the next live stream in a month or so, or whether we'll do something in between, I don't know. But we shall see. Thanks, guys, and see you another time.